He had 12 hours at most. That was how long the raft had left before the first serious wave capsized that rotten wreck and drowned all four of them. The problem was, 3 of the 4 thought the extra mouth should be thrown overboard right now, and the woman with the bone knife at his throat had almost made up her mind. The first thing he feels is water. The icy, salty muck creeps into his nose and throat, burning his lungs from the inside. Han Do Yoon's whole body jerks as he rolls onto his side. He vomits seawater right onto the wet planks. The planks are rough and rotten, shifting beneath him as if alive. He struggles to open his eyes, but the sun is so bright that he squints them shut again. There's a rumbling in his ears, not the sound of waves, a low, heavy rumble, as if someone far away were striking a huge bell underwater. He tries again. This time it works. Above him is a gray sky, not overcast, gray like a concrete ceiling. He is lying on his back on something flat and wet, a raft, 3 by 4 meters. The planks are tied together with hemp rope. The knots are crooked, damp wood, no resin, no preservative, just planks and rope. And the smell, the thick, heavy smell of rotting seaweed rolls up his throat, making him nauseous. Then he sees faces, 3 women's faces. One is standing right above him. Her once expensive silk robe is now wet and torn. Her face is angry. Her lips are moving. She's counting something to herself. The second stands to the right. She is silent. In her hand is something white, a knife, not metal, bone. A fragment of bone sharpened to razor's edge, and she holds this knife to his throat. She doesn't press it in, but she doesn't pull it away either. The third stands on her knees a short distance away. She presses a wet bronze medallion to her forehead and whispers, a prayer. Do Young blinks. She looks at the knots beneath her, and her brain kicks in before fear takes hold. A trapezoidal knot. The knots aren't counter-tightened. The center of gravity is shifted aft by about 50 centimeters. The first serious wave will capsize this thing. The wood is raw, soft, and uncaulked. No nets, no water barrels, no compass. These people had 6 hours left, 12 at most. He doesn't know where he is, doesn't know how he got here. The last thing he remembers is the night ferry from Vietnam, the hole cracking along the weld. The very same seam he pointed out in his report a week ago. Black water. And a thought, I told you so. And now he's on a rotten raft in the middle of an ocean he doesn't know, under a sky that looks wrong. And 3 women are looking at him as if he were a problem, one that needs to be solved, or get rid of. He opens his mouth and speaks, in a language he never learned, but for some reason, he understands. He says the knife needs to be put away. He says he knows how to make sure they don't drown by evening, but first they have to untie one knot, the one at the stern. It's held together by a promise. If they don't retie it in an hour, they'll all sink. The woman in the robe blinks. The hunter lowers her bone. The priestess stops praying and looks up at him. No one answers, but the knife is removed from his throat. Do Yoon sits down. His head is spinning so much that he has to brace his hands against the planks, slick with seaweed. He counts. 14 planks. 8 long, 6 short. A single layer. No cross-bracing, no truss. This isn't a raft. It's floating junk that's lucky not to have fallen apart. The rope is wet so it stretches, so the knots are slipping. He touches the nearest one. Just as he thought. The knot has already slipped 2 fingers width. It'll slip more in a day. Then a plank will pop out, and the domino effect will begin. The woman in the robe speaks, sharply, angrily. He has to explain who he is and how he ended up in the water. They fished him out 3 hours ago, and she's still not sure it was a good idea. No food, no water. They don't need a 4th mouth to feed. Do Yoon looks at her, at the hunter with the knife, at the priestess with the medallion, back at the knots. He replies that he understands perfectly well about the 4th mouth, but they won't be retying the fastenings in the next hour, and the mouths will cease to be a problem altogether, because all 4 will end up underwater. The merchant's wife falls silent. The hunter stares without blinking. Her eyes are cold, like those of a bird of prey. She is silent but shifts. She makes room for him. Do Yoon gets down on all 4s. She crawls toward the stern knot. The rope is swollen and loose. The knot was tied the way, in his world, people tie clotheslines on the balcony. It'll do for a clothesline. For a raft in the open ocean, it's a death sentence. He unties it. His hands are shaking. His fingers won't obey him. The salt water is eating away at his skin. but he knows what he's doing. At the shipyard in Ulsan, he spent 4 years tying knots on mooring lines, a figure eight with a loop, the most reliable knot for a wet rope. It doesn't slip, it doesn't slide, it holds twice its own breaking strength. He unties the stern knot, the raft jerks, the merchant's wife screams, the huntress grabs the edge of the plank, the priestess clutches her medallion tighter. Do Yoon doesn't stop. He reties the knot with a figure eight. He tightens it. He tugs. It holds. He crawls over to the next one. There are 22 of them, 22 knots, and not a single one is right. He reties them all. One watches with suspicion, another with interest. A third prays but glances at his hands out of the corner of her eye. An hour later, half are tied. His hands are scraped raw. His back aches. The sun climbs higher and burns. He's so thirsty his tongue sticks to the roof of his mouth. But the raft behaves differently. It stops creaking with every wave. It stops rocking. It becomes sturdier. Not by much, but noticeably. The merchant's wife notices this. She stops counting with her lips. She just sits and looks at his hands. Then she asks where he learned to do this. Do Yoon replies that it's a long story, and that right now there's a more important problem, the center of gravity. He points with his hand. All three are huddled near the bow. The belongings are near the bow too. The stern is sticking out of the water, and the bow is sinking. The very first serious wave will hit the bow and flood the raft. We need to shift the cargo, and the people. He asks the merchant's wife to sit closer to the center. She's indignant. She's been sitting here from the very beginning, and won't move just because some stranger tells her to. Do Yoon doesn't argue. He points his finger at the horizon. In the southwest, the sky is darker than everywhere else. Just a little. An ordinary person wouldn't notice, but for someone who's worked at sea for 4 years, it's a clear signal. A wave. In an hour. Maybe an hour and a half. He tells the merchant's wife that a wave is coming from that direction. Not a storm, just a wave. 2 meters high. And if the cargo stays on the bow, the raft will take on water. It'll take on water, and half the tied knots will get wet again and start to come undone. And in 4 hours, the raft will fall apart. The merchant's wife is silent. The huntress is silent. The priestess rises from her knees and without a word moves to the center. The merchant's wife looks at the priestess, then at Do Yoon. She stands up and moves over as well, with a stony face, but she moves. The hunter remains in place. She stares blankly for a long time. Then she moves, not to the center, slightly to the left, to the spot she deems correct. Do Yoon looks at the raft. To the left isn't ideal, but it's acceptable. He nods. The huntress bows her head, the first sign of agreement from her. Now the water. Not a single container, no barrel, no wineskin, no shard. He looks at the merchant's wife's robe. The fabric is thin, dense, waterproof. He asks if he can take a piece. She looks as if he's asking for her hand in marriage. She says no. This robe cost more than he's earned in his entire life. Do Yoon replies that the robe won't help her when she dies of thirst in 2 days. The merchant's wife presses her lips together. She unties her belt and tears off the bottom layer of fabric. She flings it in his face. She turns away. Do Young catches it. He doesn't let on. He smooths it out. It's thick, barely letting any air through. Just what he needs. He assembles a solar still. At the shipyard, he saw the guys from the emergency department doing this. The principle is simple. A container of salt water. Above it, a fabric dome on a frame. The sun heats the water. Steam rises. It condenses on the fabric. It drips to the edge. Fresh water. Slowly. A glass a day, if he's lucky. But a glass of fresh water in the open ocean is the difference between life and death. He needs a frame. There are no spare planks. He looks at the priestess's medallion. Useless. At the hunter's knife. A long, curved bone. He asks to borrow it. She won't give it to him. She says one word. No. Do Young doesn't insist. He finds a splinter of wood near the stern. He breaks it off with his hands. His fingers explode with pain again. From the splinter and some cloth, he assembles a crooked but functional structure. He pours seawater into the hollow between the planks. He covers it with cloth. He presses down on the edges. He sits down next to it. The merchant's wife asks what it is. He replies that it's their chance to have a drink tomorrow. She looks at the contraption, then at him. She doesn't say thank you, but she stops looking at him as if he were a problem. That's enough. Then a wave comes, exactly an hour and a half later, just as he said. The raft rocks, hard. The bow plunges into the water right to the very edge. Water slams against the planks. The priestess screams. The merchant's wife clings to the rope. The huntress doesn't flinch. The raft rights itself, slowly, with difficulty, but it rights itself. It doesn't capsize. The new knots hold. The center of gravity works. The raft is still flimsy, still on the brink, but it didn't fall apart. Do Yoon exhales. His hands are shaking. His back aches. His mouth tastes of salt and vomit. But he is alive, and the 3 women beside him are alive. The merchant's wife sits down. For the first time, she doesn't stand, but sits. She lowers her shoulders. She says quietly that she doesn't understand where he came from. Do Yoon doesn't answer. He looks at the horizon, at the gray sky, at the endless ocean, at a world he doesn't know, at the knots that hold it all together. And for the first time in a very long time, he feels that someone needs him right now. Not in a week, not after the meeting, not when they read his report, right now. The sun is setting, the first day is ending, the raft is holding, the still is working, drop by drop, but it's working. Tomorrow he'll need a sail, and a way to catch fish, and to figure out where they're drifting, but that's tomorrow. Right now, he's just breathing, and listening to the ocean, and the ocean, in some inexplicable way, is listening to him. The morning began with a scream, so Rin jumped to her feet and yelled that the water in the hollow had gone bad. Do Yoon lifted his head. His neck was stiff from sleeping on the planks. He crawled over to the still and looked. The water in the basin was greenish and smelled of seaweed, but it was salt water, the original water, the water he had poured in yesterday. That's how it was supposed to be. He looked at the inside of the cloth, tiny droplets, clean, clear. They were trickling toward the center where the cloth sagged. There hung a single large droplet the size of a fingernail. Do Yoon gently tilted the cloth. The droplet rolled onto his finger. He licked it. Fresh. Slightly warm, but fresh. He told So Rin that the rotten green sludge was normal. It meant the system was working. Dirty water at the bottom, clean water at the top. So Rin looked at him suspiciously. Then she looked at the drop, then at him. She didn't say anything but sat back down. Yoon Mei approached quietly. She looked at the drop on the fabric. She whispered something. Do Yoon didn't catch it. Then she looked up at him and said that water was a gift from the sea. Do Yoon replied that the water was condensation and that a gift from the sea would come when he built a proper structure, not this. Yoon Mei smiled. It was the first smile he'd seen on this raft. Now for the sail. Do Yoon had been thinking about it since the evening. There was no more fabric. So Rin had already given up the bottom layer of her robe and was walking around wrapped in the top one. There wasn't any extra rope either, but he needed at least something to catch the wind. Otherwise, the current would carry them who knows where. He examined the raft. One plank at the stern was longer than the rest. It stuck out 1/2 a meter beyond the edge. If he pulled it out and stood it upright, it would make a mast. A primitive one, a crooked one, but a mast. The problem was that if he pulled the plank out of the raft, a hole would appear, and the raft would lose its rigidity. Do Yoon counted in his head, 14 planks. If he removed one, 13 would remain. The surface area would decrease. But if he rearranged the remaining ones with an overlap, he could compensate for it, partially. He said he needed to rebuild part of the raft, so Rin said he was crazy. Li Na remained silent. Yoon Mei said she trusted him. So Rin looked at the priestess as if she were a traitor. Do Yoon began to work. He untied 3 knots at the stern. He pulled out a long plank. The raft jerked. So Rin grabbed the edge and cursed in a language that Do Yoon understood, though he hadn't heard some of the words before. Merchant curses, apparently. He slid 2 adjacent planks toward the gap that had formed. He tied them together. The gap became smaller. Then he took a short plank from the other end and laid it across. He tied it down. Now the raft was slightly smaller but sturdier, and he had a plank for a mast. The mast needed to be secured, vertically, on a flat raft with no mast socket. He looked at the rope. There was almost none left. He turned to Young Mei and looked at her locket. A chain, bronze, long. Yoon Mei noticed his gaze. She pressed the locket to her chest. Her eyes grew wide. She said it was her temple's locket, that her mentor had given it to her, that without it, she couldn't hear the voice of the sea. Do Yoon said he only needed the chain. She could keep the locket. Young May stood motionless. Then she slowly removed the chain from the locket. Her hands were trembling. She held out the chain to Do Yoon and quietly told him to treat it with care. Do Yoon took the chain. He used it as one of the guy lines. He tied the mastboard to 3 points on the raft, a rope and a bronze chain. Not perfect. The mast stood a little crooked, but it stood. Now the sail. There was no fabric. He looked at So Rin. She looked at him and said no, that she wouldn't give up her outer robe, that she'd rather drown. Do Yoon didn't argue. He examined the raft once more. A scrap of burlap hung from one of the knots, rough and thick, small, maybe 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter, uselessly small for a sail, but better than nothing. He tied the burlap to the mast, spread it out. The wind filled it immediately. The raft didn't move, the sail was too small, but it adjusted their course slightly, by a few degrees. Do Yoon sensed the change, barely noticeable, but it was there. Now for the fish. That was the problem. They had neither a hook nor a line nor a net. Lee Na was still silent, sitting in her spot with a knife in her hand. Do Yoon approached her, carefully. She followed him with her eyes. He sat down 2 steps away from her, no closer. He said he needed help, that he could build anything from anything, but he didn't know how to hunt. If she knew how to fish from the raft, he was ready to listen. Lee Na looked at him, silently, for a long time. Then she looked over the side. The water was dark, deep. Something was moving beneath the surface. Shadows, long and slow. Fish, large. Lee Na stood up. Without saying a word, she walked to the edge of the raft. She gripped her bone knife in a reverse grip. She froze. Do Yoon watched. A minute passed. 2, 3. Then Lee Na struck. Her arm shot downward like a spring. The knife plunged into the water. Splashes flew in all directions. Lee Na pulled her hand out. A fish thrashed at the end of the knife. Flat, silvery, the size of a palm. She threw the fish onto the planks. The fish thrashed. So Rin recoiled. Do Yoon looked at the catch. Small. Not enough for the 4 of them. But it was food. The first in 2 days for the 3 of them. He didn't know how long they'd been drifting before they were picked up. Lee Na froze over the water again. 10 minutes later, 3 fish lay on the planks. Lee Na turned to him and spoke the first words he'd heard from her. She said he would be the one to clean them. Do Yoon nodded. He had no idea how to clean fish. At the shipyard in Ulsan, he'd eaten sushi from vending machine containers. But he picked up a bone fragment that Lee Na had silently placed next to him and began. Clumsily, awkwardly. So Rin grimaced as she watched him. Lee Na watched with an expression that could have been mockery or something else. Yoon May helped. She sat down next to him and showed him how to properly slit the belly and remove the innards. Her hands were deft, accustomed to the task. Do Yoon asked where the priestess had learned to do this. Yoon May replied that at her temple, fish were offerings to the sea, and she had been cleaning them every day since she was 7. Do Yoon thought that the priestess with a knife was more dangerous than she looked. They ate the fish raw. There was no fire. There was no salt. The meat was tough and bland and tasted of mud. But they ate, all 4 of them, in silence. For the first time they were doing something together. They didn't argue. They didn't threaten each other. They just ate. After the meal, Do Yoon lay down on the planks again and closed his eyes. He thought. The raft is lashed together. There's a sail, tiny and useless, but there is one. There will be water, drop by drop. Lee Na catches fish with a knife. It's a temporary solution. The knife will get dull. The fish might swim deeper. We need a net. We need rope. We need a proper sail. We need fire. We need a compass. He needed at least some idea of where they were heading. He opened his eyes and looked at the sky. Gray, flat, not a cloud or a star. He couldn't tell which way was which. The sun had risen to his left that morning, or so he thought. He wasn't sure. He turned to Yoon May. She was sitting with her eyes closed, holding the locket in her cupped hands. He asked if she knew where they were. Yoon May opened her eyes. She said they were west of the inner islands, maybe 3 days' journey, maybe 5, it depends on the current. She said the current here flows southwest. If they do nothing, it will carry them out into the open ocean, into empty water, to a place where there are no islands for hundreds of miles. Do Yoon asked how she knew that. Yoon Mei replied that she could feel it. Do Yoon remained silent. She just feels it. At the shipyard in Ulsan, that wouldn't have stood as an argument. But at the shipyard in Ulsan, he had instruments and charts and GPS. Here he had a rotten raft and a priestess with a medallion. He decided he'd trust the priestess for now, because there were no other options. He took Yoon Mei's medallion. She snorted but didn't stop him. He tied the medallion to a string made from the frayed edge of the burlap sack. He lowered it over the side. The medallion began to swing, in circular motions, slowly, a pendulum. He noted the direction of rotation, then he pulled it up, lowered it again. The direction was the same. It wasn't a compass, but it was at least some way to track the consistency of our course. If the medallion swings the same way, it means the current isn't changing. If it suddenly starts swinging differently, it means something has changed. Primitive, unreliable, but better than nothing. Yoon Mei watched him. Then she said quietly that he was using the sacred medallion as a tool. Before Yoon could answer, she said that he was using it as a pendulum, and that if the sea was truly a living being, it would hardly take offense at an attempt to survive. Yoon Mei was silent for a long time. Then she said he was strange. The second day was drawing to a close. The sun had set, the sky darkened, stars appeared, bright and unfamiliar. Not a single constellation he knew, neither the Big Dipper nor Orion. A different sky, a different world. Do Yoon lay on his back and looked up. Yoon Mei lay curled up next to him. So Rin sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. Lee Na stood at the edge of the raft and gazed into the darkness. 4 people on a rotten raft in the middle of an endless ocean, under strange stars, with a drop of fresh water and 3 fish in their stomachs. Tomorrow they would have to make a net. They needed to figure out how to make fire. They needed to decide where to sail. But that was tomorrow. Right now, Do Young closed his eyes and fell into a deep sleep for the first time in 2 days. He dreamed of a weld, a long crack running along the ferry's hull, and a voice speaking not in Korean, but in that new language he now understood. The voice spoke a single phrase: build. The distiller yielded its first drop of fresh water. Do Yoon rebuilt part of the raft and erected a mast from a salvaged plank, a sail made from a scrap of burlap. Lee Na helped for the first time by catching 3 fish with a knife. Yoon Mei said they were being carried southwest toward open water. Do Yoon made a primitive pendulum from a medallion to track their course. At night, he dreamed of a voice that said one word: build. On the 3rd day, So Rin began counting. Do Yoon woke up to her muttering numbers. She was sitting in her spot in the center of the raft, folding her fingers. He asked what she was counting. So Rin replied that she was counting the days, and the water consumption, and calories, and the probability that they would survive until the end of the week. Do Yoon asked what the result was. So Rin looked at him and said the result was bad. The distiller yielded about a 1/4 cup of fresh water a day. For 4 people, that was nothing. A person needs at least a liter a day to stay alive. They had 16 times less than that. Do Yoon knew that. He'd known it since yesterday. But it's one thing to know, and another to hear someone count it out loud. He had to scale it up. 1 distiller is 1 drop. They need 4, 5, 6. But each one needed fabric and a frame and a container for the brine. There was no more fabric. So-rin sat in her robe and looked at him as if she were reading his mind. She said she wouldn't give up the robe. Do Yoon replied that he wasn't asking. He was lying. He wanted to ask, but he knew So-rin would refuse. Well, there's other material. He looked over the raft. Burlap was already on the mast. The rope was all knotted up. His own clothes. He looked at himself. He was wearing what he'd fallen in here wearing. A shirt. Lightweight. Synthetic. Polyester. He froze. Polyester. Synthetic fabric. Waterproof. Perfect for a distiller. Better than So-rin's silk. He took off his shirt. So-rin turned away. Yoon Mei looked and quickly lowered her eyes. Lee Na didn't turn away. Yoon didn't notice. He spread out the shirt. It was big, enough for 2 distillers if cut. But he had nothing to cut with. He looked at Lee Na, at her bone knife. Lee Na followed his gaze. Then she silently held out the knife, handle first. It was the first time she had given him anything voluntarily. Du Yong took the knife. The bone blade was sharp but brittle. He carefully cut the shirt into 2 pieces. He returned the knife. Lee Na took it and sat back down in her place. From the 2 pieces of shirt, he assembled 2 additional stills. The constructions were crude. One was held together with sticks from split boards, the second on scraps of rope. But they worked. By noon, droplets had appeared on the fabric. 3 times as many as yesterday, Do Yoon counted. 3 distillers. About 3/4 of a glass a day. Still not enough, but no longer death. Slow dehydration, but not death. So Rin watched him. Then she said she needed to say something. Do Yoon turned around. So Rin said she'd been thinking for 2 days and had come to a conclusion. She said he was useful, not as a person, as a resource, and that she was willing to temporarily grant him the right to make decisions regarding the raft's construction. Only regarding the construction. She would decide everything else. Do Yoon almost laughed. A merchant's wife on a rotten raft in the middle of the ocean was dividing up authority. He replied that he accepted her terms. So-rin nodded, businesslike, as if they'd signed a contract. Then she pulled a small bundle from the inner pocket of her robe. She unwrapped it. Inside was a piece of dark wax the size of a finger. She said it was ship's sealing wax. She always carried it with her for business documents. Do Yoon took the wax. He turned it over in his hands. Wax, flammable, water repellent. He could rub it on the rope, and the knots would stop getting wet and slipping. He could seal the cracks between the planks, and the raft would be drier. He could. He paused. There wasn't much wax. It wouldn't be enough for everything. He had to choose. He chose the cracks, the most dangerous ones, the ones through which water seeped in with every wave. He melted the wax with the warmth of his palms, kneaded it, sealed 3 cracks at the stern. The water stopped seeping in. The raft became drier. So Rin watched. Then she said quietly that this wax cost 20 silver coins apiece. Do Yoon replied that dry feet were worth more. For the first time in 3 days, So Rin almost smiled. Almost. After noon, the wind changed. Do Yoon noticed it by the pendulum. The medallion on the string began to swing in the other direction. The current was shifting. Yoon Mei lifted her head and looked at the water. She said they were entering the blue current zone. Do Yoon asked what a blue current was. Yoon Mei explained that there are currents sailors call blue currents. They originate from the eternal storms. The water in them is warmer and saltier, and there are more fish in them, but they aren't predictable. They might carry you in one direction for a day, and then turn in the other. Do Yoon looked at the water. It really had taken on a slightly different hue, darker, deeper. He decided that the blue current was both good and bad. Good because there were more fish, bad because of the unpredictable course. He turned to Lee Na. She was already standing at the edge of the raft, looking down. There were more shadows in the blue current. The fish were bigger. Lee Na cast, missed, cast again, hit, pulled out a fish, bigger than yesterday, the size of a forearm, silvery with a blue stripe down its side. Lee Na struck again, and again. In an hour, she'd pulled 6 fish out of the water. 6. That was a lot. More than they could eat in one sitting. Do Yoon realized they'd have to save some. Without salt or fire, raw fish would rot in a day. But if they sliced it thinly and laid it out on boards in the sun, it would dry out. Not ideal, but it would last 2 days instead of 1. He asked Lee Na for a knife. She gave it to him again, without a word. He sliced 3 fish into thin strips. He laid them out on the feeding boards. The sun was hot. By evening, the fish would be dried. Yoon Mei helped lay them out. She said that in her temple, they dried fish this way before major ceremonies. Do Yoon replied that in his world, fishermen in villages did it this way. Yoon Mei asked what kind of world it was. Do Yoon fell silent. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he could tell the truth. He didn't know if they would believe him. He said he would tell her later. Yoon Mei nodded. She didn't press him. So Rin pressed him. She walked over and said she wanted to know right now who he was, where he was from, why he spoke like a local but didn't know simple things, why he tied knots that no one had ever seen, why he knew how to extract water from the air. Do Yoon looked at her, then at Lee Na, then at Yoon Mei. He decided to tell part of the truth. He said he had come from far away, very far away. from a place where ships are built not of wood but of metal, where water flows through pipes into every house, where there are machines that calculate faster than any human. So Rin said he was lying, that there are no ships made of metal because metal sinks. Do Yoon replied that metal sinks if it's just a lump of metal, but if you give it the right shape and distribute the air inside, it will float, because it's not the material that matters, but the volume and displacement. So Rin was silent. She was thinking. Do Yoon could see the gears turning in her head. She was a merchant's daughter. She understood logic, even if she didn't understand physics. She said, "Let's say that's true." She said that if he was so smart, he should tell them how they were going to get out of there. Do Yoon replied that, for starters, they needed to stop drifting and start moving in a specific direction. For that, they needed a proper sail. A scrap of burlap wouldn't do. It barely corrected their course. They needed fabric, lots of fabric, and they needed a keel. Without a keel, the raft glides across the water like a leaf. The wind pushes it, but doesn't steer it. So Rin asked where they would get fabric in the middle of the ocean. Do Yoon didn't answer, because he didn't know. In the evening, they ate 3 fresh fish. 3 were drying on the stern. There wasn't much water, but there was some. 3 distillers were running, drop by drop, slowly, but they were running. At night, Do Young didn't sleep. He lay there and calculated water supply, fish supply, drift speed, wind direction, strength of the knots, time until the next serious wave. He thought about what needed to be done tomorrow, the day after, and a week from now. He thought about how 4 people on a raft weren't a crew. They were 4 strangers who hadn't yet decided to trust one another. So Reen trusted his hands, but not his words. Lee Na didn't trust anyone, but handed him a knife because she saw the results. Yoon Mei trusts him, but for reasons he doesn't understand. He needed to do more than just build. He needed to get these 3 to start working together. Because an engineer without a team is just a man with ideas, and ideas don't float. On the morning of the 4th day, Lee Na woke him up. She nudged him with her foot. He opened his eyes. She was standing over him, pointing toward the horizon. There was something there. A dark spot. Far away. Very far away. But a spot. Not a cloud. Not a wave. Something solid. Do Yoon sat up. He squinted. The dot wasn't moving. It was staying put. So Reen crawled closer. She saw it too. She asked what it was. Do Yoon didn't know. But if it was an island, it was a chance. If it was a ship, it might be a chance. Or the end. He looked at the burlap sail. Useless. He looked at the mast. Crooked. Then he looked at Soreen. She understood his gaze. She said no. He didn't argue, but he kept watching. Soreen clenched her teeth. Then she unbuttoned her robe and pulled it off her shoulders. She tossed it to him. She was left in a thin undershirt. She crossed her arms over her chest and turned away. Do Yoon caught the robe. Silk, heavy, large, enough for a sail. He removed the burlap from the mast, tied the robe to it, smoothed it out. The wind filled the fabric. The raft jerked and moved, slowly, heavily, but it moved, toward the dark spot on the horizon. So Rin sat in her wet shirt, shivering in the wind. Yoon Mei silently took off her outer cloak and draped it over So Rin's shoulders. So Rin looked at the priestess. She said nothing, but she didn't take off the cloak. Do Yoon stood by the mast and held the course. The dot on the horizon was slowly growing. It wasn't an island. It was a boat, capsized, abandoned, but a boat. Wood, rope, maybe tools, maybe water, maybe salvation. Do Yoon looked at her and calculated. Distance, wind speed, time. At this speed, they would reach it in 4 hours. If the wind didn't die down, if the current didn't carry them away, if the raft doesn't fall apart. A lot of ifs. But for the first time in 3 days, they had a goal, and they were moving toward it. Do Yoon assembled 3 stills using a cut-up synthetic shirt. Sodian admitted he was useful and gave him ship's wax to seal the cracks. The raft entered a blue current teeming with fish. Lina caught 6 fish. Do Yoon explained that he had come from a world with metal ships. Sodian didn't believe him. On the 4th morning, they spotted a dark spot on the horizon. It was an overturned boat. Sodian gave her outer robe to use as a sail, and they headed toward it. Do Yoon stood by the mast for 4 hours. His legs had gone numb. His hands were numb from the rope. The sail made from Sodian's robe caught the wind unevenly. The fabric was too soft. It would billow out, then sag, and the raft moved in jerks. But it moved. The dark spot on the horizon turned into a silhouette, then into a shape, A boat. Long. About 7 meters. It was lying upside down. The hull was dark with algae. The mast was broken, but the hull was intact. Do Yoon could see that even from a distance. The waterline was even. No holes, no cracks. Just capsized. Maybe by a wave. Maybe by a storm. Sodin came up to him. She was wrapped in Yoon-May's cloak and shivering, but her eyes were burning. She said it was a small Seagull-class merchant ship. She'd seen them in the harbor back home. They carry small cargo between nearby islands, a crew of 4 or 5, a load of up to a ton. Yoon asked how she could tell the type of boat from such a distance. So Rin looked at him indulgently and said that she'd traded on these boats for 3 years and knew every model by its silhouette, just as he knows his knots. Do Yoon nodded. As they got closer, he saw more. The boat was drifting slowly. Debris was floating in the water around it. Planks, pieces of cloth, ropes, a barrel. A barrel. Do Yoon tensed. The barrel was floating 10 meters from the boat, rocking, intact. He looked at Lee Na. She was already looking at the barrel, then at him, then at the water between the raft and the barrel. 10 meters, a piece of cake for a swimmer. For Do Yoon, who swam like a brick, it was a problem. Lee Na jumped into the water without a word. Sodin gasped. Yoon-May grabbed the edge of the raft. Do Yoon froze. Lee Na swam. Fast. Confidently. Like someone who had grown up in the water. She reached the barrel in a minute. Gripped it with one hand. Swam back. The barrel was heavy. Lee Na paddled with one hand and her feet. Slowly. Do Young crawled to the edge of the raft. He reached out his hand. When Lee Na swam up, he grabbed the barrel. He pulled. Heavy. Full. He dragged the barrel onto the raft. Lee Na climbed out on her own. Wet. Cold. But not a trace of fatigue on her face. She shook herself off like a dog and sat down in her spot. Do Yoon examined the barrel. Wood. Solid. Well made. Forged iron hoops. A brand was burned into the side. Do Young didn't know what it meant. Sodin knew. She came over. She looked at the brand and turned pale. She said it was the brand of the Paryon Trading House, a small firm. It worked for Haegyong as a carrier. A month ago, the house of Haegyong accused Paryon of smuggling and burned their ships. Do Yoon asked what was in the barrel. He tapped the side. It sounded solid, liquid. He found the cork, pulled it out. He sniffed it. Water. Fresh. Slightly musty from long storage, but fresh. 20 liters, maybe 25. So Rin's lips trembled. Yoon-May covered her face with her hands. Lee Na didn't move, but her shoulders dropped slightly, as if a weight had been lifted from them. 25 liters of fresh water. If used sparingly, that's a week. A whole week of life. Do Yoon closed the stopper, carefully, tightly. Then he looked at the capsized boat. They were already 20 meters away from it. They needed to get closer. They needed to take a look. They needed to take everything they could. He steered the raft toward the boat, tied it to the side with a rope. The raft was now next to the capsized hull. The boat was bigger than it looked, 7 meters long, 2 meters wide. The hull was made of dark wood, dense and heavy. The broken mast stuck out of the water like a stump. He crawled the boat's perimeter. He tapped the hull in several places. The wood was strong. The planks fit tightly together. The seams were filled with resin, real resin, black and shiny. It was a good boat, solidly built, just capsized. Until then, Do Yoon had thought it impossible for 4 people to capsize a boat. It's too heavy, but it can be taken apart. Planks, dozens of planks of good wood, tarred, ropes, nails, metal nails. He felt one on the side, wrought iron, rough but sturdy. In this world, nails take a week to forge. Every nail is a treasure. He began to count. The hull of the boat is about 50 planks, plus the frames, plus the planking, plus the remains of the mast. If he dismantles this boat and uses the material to reinforce the raft, he won't end up with a raft. A pontoon, a real one, double-layered, with cross-bracing, with a truss, with a proper keel made from the mast remnants, with a proper sail made from something, with a supply of nails for further construction. He turned to the others. They were standing on the raft, looking at him. He said he had a plan. He said they would take the boat apart. So Rin asked why they should break up a whole boat. Do Yoon replied that the boat wasn't whole. It's capsized. They won't be able to right it. But if they take it apart for materials, they'll be able to build something real out of this raft. So Rin thought. She weighed the options. Do Yoon could see it on her face. She was weighing a whole boat against a dismantled boat. A whole boat is more valuable, but a whole boat is upside down and useless. A dismantled boat is material, and material is life. So Rin nodded. Li Na was already pulling out a knife. Yoon Mei asked how to take the boat apart without tools. Good question. They had one bone knife. No axe, no saw, no hammer. Do Yoon looked at the boat, then at the nails. If you pull out the nails, the planks will come apart on their own. But pulling a forged nail out of wet wood with bare hands was impossible. He needed a lever. He looked at the raft. He found the thinnest plank. He broke off a piece about an elbow's length. He wedged the end under the head of the first nail. He pressed down. The nail didn't budge. He pressed harder. The wood creaked. The nail shifted a millimeter. Do Yoon pressed down again. The lever broke. He looked at the splinter, then at the boat, then at Li Na. Li Na walked over. Silently, she took a bone knife. She inserted the blade under the nail's head. She struck the handle with her palm. The nail popped. Clean. Quick. Li Na looked at him and raised an eyebrow slightly. It was an expression that Do Young interpreted for himself as, well, what else can't you do yourself? He showed her the next nail. They worked until evening. Li Na pulled out the nails. Do Young removed the planks. So Rin counted and sorted them. Whole boards in one pile, cracked ones in another, nails in one pile, rope scraps in another. Yoon Mei held the raft by the boat and watched the water. She said she felt movement below, something big. Du Young asked what exactly. Yoon Mei replied that she didn't know, but it had passed by. Du Young decided not to think about it. By sunset, they had removed 23 planks from the boat, 18 nails, 2 pieces of tarred rope, and they had broken off a meter-long piece of the mast. The raft was piled high with materials. It sat lower in the water from the weight, but it was a weight worth bearing. Du Young looked at the materials, and for the first time in 4 days, felt not anxiety, but something akin to anticipation. 23 planks of tarred wood. This isn't a raft, it's a future pontoon. Tomorrow he would start rebuilding. Tomorrow this piece of junk would become something else. He sat down at the stern. He took a sip of water from the barrel. The first sip of normal fresh water in 4 days. The water was slightly musty, slightly cloudy, but it was better than anything he'd ever drunk in his life. So Rin sat down next to him. She said he was working well. Then she paused and added that it wasn't a compliment, but an observation. Du Yoon replied that he'd taken note. Li Na sat at the bow, sharpening her knife on a plank. Yoon Mei prayed, quietly, slowly, pressing a medallion without a chain to her lips. 4 people on a raft piled high with planks in the middle of the ocean, with a barrel of water and a pile of nails. It wasn't much, but yesterday they had nothing. They reached an overturned small Seagull-class merchant boat. Li Na pulled a barrel containing 25 liters of fresh water out of the water. The boat turned out to be from the Paryon trading house, destroyed by the Haegyong house. The 4 of them dismantled part of the boat. They salvaged 23 planks of tarred wood, 18 forged nails, 2 lengths of tarred rope, and a piece of mast. Du Yoon plans to rebuild the raft into a pontoon. Yoon Mei said she senses something big under the water. Du Yoon woke up before dawn, not from a sound, from a thought. He lay with his eyes closed and saw a blueprint before him, not on paper, in his head. A pontoon, double-layered, the bottom layer made of the old planks from the raft. They're soft and damp but still hold together. The top layer is made of new planks from the boat, tarred, sturdy. The 2 layers are fastened together crosswise. This provides rigidity in both directions. Cross-bracing made from scraps of the mast. A keel made from a long piece of the mast in the center of the bottom layer. Not a real keel, just an imitation, but enough to keep the raft from sliding sideways in a crosswind. The sail is made from So Rin's robe on a makeshift mast from the leftover boat mast. The mast has guy lines made of tarred rope, 3 stills on top. The barrel is secured in the center for balance. The total platform area is about 4 by 5 meters. The displacement is sufficient for 6 people, maybe 7, a safety margin. He always calculated a safety margin. At the shipyard, they laughed at him for it. They said he was a risk-averse person. He replied that risk-averse people live longer. He opened his eyes. It was still dark. The stars shone in a strange pattern. He stood up quietly so as not to wake the others. Young Mei was sleeping curled up by the barrel. So Rin was lying on her back with her arms spread out. Li Na. He looked at her spot. Empty. He turned around. She was sitting at the bow. She wasn't asleep. She was staring into the water. In the darkness, he couldn't see her face, but he saw her clenching a knife. He walked over, sat down beside her, not too close. She didn't turn around. They sat in silence. A minute. 2. Then Li Na said there was something under the water. The same thing as yesterday. It hadn't gone away. It was circling. Du Yong looked over the side. Darkness. He couldn't see anything. He asked how she knew. Li Na said the water was trembling. Du Yong didn't understand. Li Na placed her palm on the deck. She told him to do the same. He placed his palm on it. At first, nothing. Then he felt it. A very faint vibration. Not from the waves. The waves were rocking the raft up and down. This was different. A slight tremor coming from below. Steady. Rhythmic. As if something big was breathing deep beneath them. Du Yong withdrew his hand. He asked what it could be. Li Na answered with one word. Oldar. Du Yong remembered. Leviathans. Huge sea serpents. Yun Mei had talked about them on the first day. He asked how dangerous it was. Li Na paused. Then she said it depended on the size. Small oldars are about 5 to 6 meters long. They hunt fish and don't attack people, unless they're hungry. The medium ones are 15 to 20 meters long. Those can capsize a boat. The big ones. Li Na fell silent. Do Yun asked how big they were. Li Na said they were so big you couldn't see them. You only see the wave caused by their movement. And if you see that wave, it's already too late. Do Yong was silent for a moment. Then he asked about the one down below. Which one? Li Na said she didn't know, but the vibration was strong, so it wasn't small. Do Yong looked at the water. Dark. Bottomless. Something was swirling beneath them. He stood up. Panic is useless. Fear is useless. If the Oldar wants to capsize them, it will, and nothing will help. But if it's just circling, that means it isn't attacking yet. That means there's time, and that means we need to do what we can. Build. He started working when the first light touched the horizon. He laid out all the planks, the old ones separately, the new ones separately, nails in a row, ropes, pieces of the mast, taking inventory. He counted aloud. So Rin woke up to his voice. She looked at the laid out materials, then at him. Then she began counting along with him, silently, in parallel, until Yun noticed. She wasn't counting the quantity, she was counting the cost. Every plank, every nail, every piece of rope was assigned a price tag in her mind. He didn't stop her. Everyone counts the way they know how. He began the reconstruction from the bottom layer. The first thing to do was remove the top planks of the raft, place new tarred planks underneath them, crisscrossed, then put the old ones on top. It would be like a sandwich, wet, raw wood on the outside, strong, tarred wood on the inside. The structure wasn't pretty, but it was sturdy. He began untying the knots. Sorin helped. She didn't know how to tie knots, but she knew how to hold things. He told her what to hold and where to pull, and she did it quickly and precisely. No questions, no arguments. When it came to practical work, Sorin was the perfect partner. She didn't waste time on words, she just did it. Yun Mei helped too. She handed him the planks. She held the rope steady. She wasn't as fast as Sorin, but she was more careful, handled each plank carefully, as if she were afraid of hurting it. Do Yoon didn't comment. Li Na didn't help. She stood at the edge of the raft and looked into the water. She kept watch. Do Yoon was grateful to her for that. Someone had to keep watch while they took the raft apart and put it back together. By noon, the bottom layer was ready. 8 new planks lay crisscrossed beneath the old ones, fastened with nails, real wrought iron nails. Do Yoon hammered them in with a piece of the broken mast, roughly, crookedly, but securely. He counted the blows, 3 blows per nail, no more. The wood was already wet. Extra blows would split the plank. When he hammered in the last nail of the bottom layer, he stood up and hopped on the raft. The raft didn't creak, it didn't wobble. He jumped harder. The planks flexed slightly but didn't come apart. Sorin jumped down next to him. She wasn't exactly testing it, she wanted to feel it. Do Yoon could see it on her face. When the raft didn't budge beneath her, she exhaled, long and deep, as if she were releasing she'd been holding inside for 4 days. Then she quickly turned away. Do Yoon didn't look. Next was the keel, a 1-meter-long piece of mast. He secured it in the center of the bottom layer, straight down. To do this, he had to dive under the raft, or rather not dive, but climb under the water, holding onto the planks with his hands. Because he didn't. The water was cold, dark. He couldn't see the bottom. He couldn't see anything except the underside of the raft. He spent 20 seconds underwater. He secured the mast with 2 nails. He climbed out. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the fact that there was something down there. He could feel it, that very vibration Li Na had mentioned, close by. He didn't say anything. He went back to work. By evening the pontoon was ready, not perfect, but it wasn't a raft anymore. A double layer of planks with cross bracing, a keel in the center, a mast made from a long scrap of a boat mast, secured with 3 tension lines made of tarred rope. The sail, made from So Rin's robe, was retied. A water barrel was secured at the center of gravity. 3 distillers at the stern where there was the least roll. The platform was 4 by 5 meters, stable, rigid, with a keel that cut through the waves rather than bouncing over them. Enough space for 6 or 7 people, maybe 8 if they're not all standing at once. Do Yoon stood on his pontoon and felt the difference under his feet. 3 days ago, it was junk, a bunch of planks tied together with rope. Now it was a structure, with logic, with calculation, with a safety margin. Soden walked over and stood beside him. She said the pontoon looked like a real one. Do Yoon replied that it was a real one. Soden shook her head and said no. A real pontoon takes 10 people 2 weeks to build, and he built this one with 3 others in a single day. Do Yoon replied that this pontoon was far from a real one, that it had weak spots, that the 4 nails on the starboard side held 3 planks instead of 2, and if a wave hit from the right, the load would be uneven, that the keel was short, and in strong crosswinds, they'd still be blown off course, that the sail was the wrong shape and lost 1/3 of the wind. Soden listened. Then she said that was the longest description of flaws she'd ever heard from a man who'd just built something out of nothing. Do Yoon replied that spotting flaws was his job, to see them before they became a problem, because in his world, they'd failed to see one, and 120 people had gone down with the ship. Soden fell silent. She realized he wasn't talking about this world. She didn't ask. That night, the older surfaced. Do Yoon didn't see it. He was asleep. Li Na woke him up. She covered his mouth with her hand and pointed overboard. He turned his head. In the moonlight, something lay on the surface of the water. Long, dark, smooth. At first he thought it was a log. Then the log moved, slowly, smoothly, without a single splash. And he realized it wasn't a log. It was a back, a part of a body, which extended in both directions and faded into the darkness. The Oldar lay on the surface next to the pontoon, 5 meters away, maybe 4. Do Yoon wasn't breathing. Li Na wasn't breathing. So Rin was asleep. Yoon Mei. Do Yoon looked at her. She wasn't asleep. She was sitting with her eyes open, staring at the Oldar, and there was no fear on her face. There was something else on her face. Recognition. Yoon Mei slowly raised her hand. Do Yoon wanted to grab her, to stop her, but Li Na caught his hand and squeezed it, tightly. Don't move. Yoon Mei reached out toward the water. She didn't quite reach it. The Oldar lay motionless. Then part of his body lifted slightly. For a single second, an eye appeared from the water. One eye, huge, the size of a human head, yellow with a black vertical pupil. The eye looked at the pontoon, at the people, at Do Yoon. He couldn't look away. The eye was intelligent, not like an animal's, like a creature that thinks, that assesses, that decides. The eye stared for 3 seconds, then it closed. Oldar's body slid down, soundlessly, without a ripple. It just vanished. The vibration beneath the planks subsided. The water calmed. Silence. Do Yoon was breathing, heavily, rapidly. Li Na let go of his hand. White marks from her fingers remained on his skin. Yoon Mei lowered her hand. She turned to him and said quietly that it had come to look at him. Do Yoon asked why at him. Yoon Mei replied that she didn't know, but it wasn't looking at the pontoon or at them. It was looking at him. Do Young wanted to say that was nonsense, that sea creatures don't stare at specific people, that it was just a big snake swimming by, but he remembered that eye, yellow, with a black pupil, intelligent, and the words stuck in his throat. He didn't sleep until morning. He sat and stared at the water. The water was calm, dark, empty, but he knew that somewhere down below, something was swimming, something that had come to look at the man building a house on the water. In the morning he got up, sleep-deprived, exhausted, but with a clear head. He needed to continue dismantling the boat. He needed to get the remaining planks and nails. He needed to set a proper sail. He needed to set a course. He needed to find land, or at least other people. He looked at his pontoon, sturdy, stable, his, the first thing he'd built in this world. He looked at the three women. So Rin was untangling the remains of the rope. Li Na was sharpening a knife. Young Mei was staring at the water. They weren't a team yet, but they were already something. 4 people who'd survived 5 days in the ocean and hadn't killed each other. In this world, apparently, that was already an achievement. Do Yoon turned toward the capsized boat. It was still tied to the raft, still full of supplies. He walked over to Li Na and asked for the knife. She handed it to him, without looking, with a practiced motion, as if they'd always done this. Do Yoon took the knife and went to dismantle the boat further. Build. The voice from his dreams said, build. He built. Do Yoon rebuilt the raft into a 2-layer pontoon with a cross-shaped fastening. He installed a keel made from a scrap of the mast and a proper mast with shrouds. The platform was now 4 by 5 meters, with room for 6 to 7 people. At night, the Oldar surfaced next to the pontoon, a huge sea serpent with a yellow eye the size of a head. Yunmei said the creature had come to look at Do Yoon. Li Na confirmed that the Oldar was not small. The vibration after the visit disappeared. Do Yoon continues to dismantle the boat. On the 7th day they saw people. Do Yoon was standing by the mast, trimming the sail, when Li Na raised her hand. She didn't say a word. She just pointed to the southeast. Something was bobbing on the water there. Not a boat, not a piece of debris, a small rowboat, open, sitting low in the water. Do Yoon squinted. There were people in the rowboat. He counted 5 figures. 4 were sitting, 1 was lying down. So-rin came over and stood beside him. She looked at the rowboat and said it was a fishing skiff from the inner islands. Old, full of holes. She said the people in it were most likely refugees. Do Yoon unfurled the sail. The pontoon moved toward the boat, slowly, against the crosswind. The keel worked, not perfectly, but it worked. The pontoon was being blown off course, but not as much as before. An hour later, they were 20 meters away. Do Yoon saw their faces. 4 women, 1 old, with gray hair and a sunburned face. 2 young, thin, emaciated, with chapped lips. The 4th was holding the head of a 5th person on her lap. An old man. He lay motionless. Do Yoon couldn't tell if he was alive or not. So-rin called out to them in the language that Do Yoon already understood fluently. She asked who they were and where they were from. The old woman raised her head. She replied that they were from Sonhae Port, that Dom Haegyong had burned the port 3 weeks ago, that they had been sailing ever since, that they had run out of water 6 days ago. Do Yoon looked at So-rin. So-rin looked at him. 6 days without water. They were dying, right now. Do Yoon told Li Na to pull the boat in with a rope. Li Na threw the rope. One of the young women in the boat caught it with trembling hands. Li Na pulled the boat up to the pontoon. Do Yoon jumped into the rowboat. The boat rocked. He could barely stay on his feet. The first thing he did was look at the old man. Alive, breathing, but barely. Lips blue, skin gray. Dehydration, severe. Do Young shouted to Yunmei to bring water. Yunmei handed him a barrel. He pulled out the stopper. He poured water into his palm. He brought it to the old man's lips. The old man didn't react. Do Yoon pried his lips open with his fingers and poured the water in. The old man coughed. Then he swallowed. Then his eyes opened, cloudy, red. He looked at Do Yoon and whispered something. Do Yoon didn't catch it. He leaned in closer. The old man said he was a carpenter, from Sonhae, 40 years in the trade. Do Yoon gave him some more water. Then he gave the others a drink. 3 sips each, no more. Too much water right after dehydration is dangerous. The stomach can't handle it. So-rin was keeping track. She stood on the pontoon and counted the water consumption from the barrel. Do Yoon saw her lips moving. She didn't say anything, but he knew what she was thinking. There were 4. Now there were 9. The water barrel was running out twice as fast. The stills were producing just as much. The math didn't add up. He knew, but he couldn't leave 5 people to die in a leaky rowboat. He dragged all 5 of them onto the pontoon. The old woman's name was Park Sun. The 2 young men were named Min and Hae. The fourth was named Jong. She wouldn't leave the old man's side. The old man's name was Baek Gun-ho, a carpenter. Once all 5 were on the pontoon, Do Yoon inspected the rowboat. It was full of holes. It was leaking in 3 places, but the hull was made of decent wood, and there were things in it: a coil of rope, real thick ship's rope, a fishing net, small, torn, but a net, and a wooden bucket with a crack. Do Yoon took everything. Then he looked at the boat again. 4 meters long, 1.5 meters wide. If he patched the holes and tied it to the side of the pontoon, it would make an extra platform. Not for living in, for work, for drying fish, or for distillers. He tied the rowboat to the starboard side of the pontoon, patched the holes, stuffed pieces of wax-soaked cloth into the cracks. There was very little wax left. He was using every milligram. Now he had a 4 by 5 meter pontoon and a tied-up rowboat measuring 4 by 1.5 meters. The total area was larger, not by much, but 9 people were no longer standing on top of each other. In the evening, old man Peck came to his senses. He sat leaning against a barrel and drank water in small sips. Do Yoon sat down next to him. Peck looked at the pontoon, at the 2-layer structure, at the cross-shaped fastenings, at the keel, at the mast with its stays. He was silent for a long time. Then his hands began to tremble, not from weakness. Do Yoon saw his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who sees something impossible. Beck said he'd been building boats for 40 years, that he had built over 100, that he knew every method of joining planks that existed in this world, and he had never seen what he was seeing now: cross-bracing, a double layer, a keel not carved from a single piece of wood, but assembled. He asked Do Yoon who had taught him. Do Yoon replied that he was taught at the university. Beck didn't know the word university. Do Yoon said it was a place where they teach how to build. Beck asked where that place was. Do Yoon paused and said it was far away, very far away. Beck looked at him for a long time. Then he said it didn't matter where he was from. What matters is what he knows. And if he needs hands that know how to work with wood, then he, Baek Gun-ho, is ready. Do Yoon looked at his hands. Big, knotted, with calluses that had made the skin as hard as wood. The hands of a master. The hands of a man who had been building boats for 40 years. Do Yoon held out his hand. Beck shook it, firmly. So-din watched from where she sat. She didn't say anything, but Do Yoon noticed how she tilted her head slightly. So-din was calculating. Now she wasn't calculating losses, but possibilities. 1 engineer, 1 carpenter, 1 hunter, 1 merchant's wife, 1 priestess, and 4 pairs of working hands. So-din began to see what Do Yoon had seen from day 1. Not people, a system. That night, Yoon-mei sat down next to Do Yoon. He was sitting at the stern, looking out at the water. She sat down next to him, close, closer than usual. She said she felt something, not the older, something else. She said that when he was securing the pontoon that afternoon, the water around them had grown warmer, by 1 degree, maybe 2. She could feel it, in her skin. Do Yoon asked what that meant. Yoon-mei replied that she didn't know, but the ancient texts of her temple said that when the master of the sea builds upon the water, the sea responds with warmth, just as a body responds with warmth to a touch. Do Yoon said he wasn't the master of the sea. He was an engineer. Yoon-mei smiled. She said that maybe in this world it's one and the same. Do Young didn't answer. He stared at the dark water. Somewhere down there something was swimming. Something with a yellow eye the size of a human head. Something that had come to look at him. He didn't want to think about it. He wanted to think about bulkheads and nails and displacement, but the water was warm. He lowered his hand over the side. Indeed, warmer than it had been that morning. Young-mei placed her palm next to his. Their fingers almost touched in the dark water. She said nothing. He said nothing. They just sat there and listened to the ocean. On the 7th day, they picked up a rowboat with 5 refugees from the burned-down port of Songhae. The old man, Baek Gun-ho, turned out to be a carpenter with 40 years of experience. He saw the pontoon's construction and offered his help. They took a coil of rope and a torn fishing light. They tied the rowboat to the pontoon as an additional platform. Yoon-mei said the water around the pontoon had grown warmer while Do Yoon was building it. In ancient texts, this is a sign of the master of the sea. Beck changed everything. Do Yoon knew how to build. Beck knew what to build with. The difference seemed minor, but in practice it was enormous. Do Yoon could sketch a perfect frame in his head. Beck could look at a plank and tell where it would crack in a month. Do Yoon calculated the load. Beck sniffed the wood and said how long it had been in the water. They began working together on the 8th day. Do Yoon explained the principle. Beck put it into practice. First, they finished dismantling the boat. Now it went faster. Beck knew where to strike so the nail would pop out cleanly. He knew which plank to remove first so the rest wouldn't fall apart. By the end of the day, they had gutted the entire boat. 51 planks, 36 nails, 4 bent wood frames, a 2-meter-long piece of mast, 2 pieces of sailcloth, real sailcloth, thick, coarse, oil-soaked. When So-rin saw the sailcloth, her eyes lit up. She said that this fabric was worth more than all the other materials put together. Do Yoon replied that the fabric was worth exactly as much as the wind it could catch. So-rin looked at him and laughed for the first time in a week. Briefly, dryly, but she laughed. Do Yoon and Peck began building a second pontoon, a separate one, not attached to the first, but connected to it by a hinge. Do Yoon explained the principle of modularity to Peck. If 2 pontoons are rigidly connected, then during a storm, the load strikes a single connection point, and that point breaks. But if the connection is flexible, it works like a joint. Each pontoon sways separately. The load is distributed. Peck listened. His eyebrows rose higher and higher. Then he sat down on a plank and said quietly that he'd been building boats for 40 years and had never thought of it that way. Do Yoon replied that he'd spent 4 years building oil rigs, and that's exactly how they work. Module, hinge, module. You cut off the damaged section, and the rest survives. Peck was silent for a moment. Then he stood up and began to work, quickly, furiously, like a man who had been shown the door he'd been searching for his whole life. They worked for 3 days. Do Yoon designed, Peck cut and assembled. Lee Na caught fish, now with a net. They'd patched the torn net with rope, and though it didn't catch perfectly, it caught. In a day, Lee Na pulled in 10 to 15 fish, more than they could eat. With Rin, she dried them and kept track of the supply. She set up a system: fresh fish for today, dried fish for tomorrow, a 3-day supply. She calculated portions for everyone, exactly, equal shares, until Yoon noticed that she was giving her portion to Min and Hae, who still hadn't recovered from dehydration. She did it discreetly, or thought she was being discreet. Yoon Mei saw it. Yoon Mei saw everything. She would approach So-rin in the evening and silently place an extra piece of fish next to her. So-rin didn't say thank you, but she ate it. On the 11th day, the second pontoon was ready, 3 by 4 meters, lighter than the first, lower, but sturdy, connected to the first by 2 hinged joints made of rope threaded through wooden loops. Do Yoon jumped onto one pontoon, then onto the other. The hinge worked, the pontoons swayed independently, the connection held. Beck stood and watched. He said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever built in his life. Do Yoon replied that it was the ugliest thing he had ever built in his life. Beck laughed, loudly, for the first time ever. Jung, who hadn't left Beck's side, smiled. She turned out to be his granddaughter, the only survivor of his family. The second pontoon became a work platform. Fish were drying on it. There were still distillers. Do Yoon had moved them from the main pontoon to make room for people. Now 5 distillers were operating on a separate platform. He had made 2 new ones out of canvas. Canvas worked best. Thick and dark, it heated up faster in the sun. There was more water, not enough, but more. So Rin had done the math. She said that at their current consumption and production rates, they would last 2 weeks, maybe 3 if there was fish. Do Yoon replied that 3 weeks was enough to find an island. Yoon Mei shook her head. She said the nearest islands were to the northeast, inland islands. 5 to 7 days' journey with a good wind. But that's Haegyong House territory. Refugees from Songhae aren't allowed there. They'll be sunk on the approach. Do Yoon asked where they could go. Yoon Mei thought for a moment. She said that to the west were the wild islands, uninhabited rocks, no fresh water, no trees, but no Haegyong. Do Yoon asked how far they were. Yoon Mei replied that she didn't know exactly. Maybe 10 days, maybe 20. So Rin said they wouldn't last 20 days. Do Yoon said they would if they built as they went. So Rin looked at him. He explained. Every day in the ocean, they would come across debris, trash, scraps, lost cargo, wrecks of ships that Haegyeon had sunk. This ocean is full of trash because there's a war going on, and ships are sinking every day. Every piece of debris is material. Every day he would build, expand the platform, install new distillers, catch more fish. By the time they reached the wild islands, they wouldn't have 2 pontoons. They would have 5 or 6. So Rin listened. She counted. Do Yoon could see the numbers clicking in her head. She said his plan was based on the assumption that there would be enough debris in the ocean. Do Yoon replied that his plan was based on the assumption that the house of Haegyong would continue to sink ships, and of that he was certain. So Rin was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. Lee Na listened in silence. She stood up and walked over to Do Yoon. She looked him in the eyes for a long time. Then she said 3 words. "You're strange, but not a fool." Do Yoon remembered that moment. These were the first words, more than 2, that Lee Na had spoken of her own accord. They turned west. The sail caught the wind. The pontoon moved. The 2 modules swayed, each in its own way. The hinges creaked but held. 9 people on 2 pontoons in the middle of the endless ocean. They were sailing west, toward nameless cliffs, without water, without trees, but without Haegyong. Do Yoon stood by the mast and looked ahead. Beck stood nearby. The old carpenter gazed at the horizon and said nothing. Then he said that if they made it, he would build Do Yoon a boat. A real one, not a raft, not a pontoon, a boat. Do Yoon replied that it wouldn't be a boat. He replied that they would build a city. Beck and Do Yoon completely dismantled the capsized boat. They salvaged 51 planks, 36 nails, and 2 pieces of sailcloth. They built a second pontoon connected to the first by flexible joints. Do Yoon explained the principal modularity. 5 distillers on the work platform. Lee Na catches 10 to 15 fish a day with the repaired net. They decided to head west toward the Wild Islands, a 10 to 20-day journey. Do Yoon announced that he would build along the way using debris they encountered in the ocean. On the 14th day, the first real storm hit. Do Young knew it was coming. That very morning, Lee Na had pointed out the birds. 3 black birds with long tails were flying low over the water. Lee Na said these birds always fly before a storm, always. Yoon Mei confirmed it. She said the pressure was dropping. Do Yoon asked how she knew about the pressure. Yoon Mei pointed to the medallion. She said that bronze changes color when the pressure drops. It darkens. Do Yoon looked at the medallion. It really was darker than usual. Not by much, but noticeable. A barometer made from a bronze medallion. Rough, approximate, but it works. Do Yoon announced preparations for the storm, so Rin asked what prepare meant. Do Yoon replied that it meant securing everything that could fly away. Put away the stills, tie down the barrel, secure yourselves, lower the sail, and pray, if anyone knows how. Yoon Mei said she knew how. Do Yoon said that was great. They worked for 4 hours. Do Yoon gave orders. Beck secured things. So Rin counted the rope and distributed it. Lee Na checked every knot. Min and Hae helped carry things. Jung tied things down. Park Sun helped Yoon Mei roll up and put away the stills. 9 people. Everyone was doing something. No one was standing around idle. Do Yoon noticed this. A week ago, he had been alone against 3 skeptical women. Now 9 people were working at his word, not because he ordered them to, because he knew what to do, and they could see that. The storm came in the evening. The sky turned black within an hour. The wind picked up from the south, at first steady, then gusty. The waves began to grow, a meter and a half, 2. The pontoon was rocking. The hinges between the modules creaked. Do Yoon stood in the center of the first pontoon and counted. Wave period, height, direction, 3 out of 5. He said it out loud. So Rin asked what 3 out of 5 meant. Do Yoon replied that it was the storm's rating. On his personal scale, 3 was serious but not deadly. So Rin said she appreciated his optimism. The first big wave hit 10 minutes later. The pontoon soared up on the crest. Then it crashed down. A thud. The planks groaned. People fell. Do Yoon stayed on his feet because he was holding on to the mast. The mast held. The tension straps stretched like strings but didn't snap. A tarred rope. Peck knew what he was doing when he secured it. The second wave. The third. The fourth. The pontoon didn't capsize. The keel was working. It sliced through the wave. Not perfectly. Water was pouring onto the deck, but the pontoon held. The hinges between the modules creaked and groaned. Do Yoon watched them. This was the test. If the hinge failed, the modules would separate, and the people on the second pontoon would be left alone, without a mast, without a sail. The hinge held. The rope stretched. The wooden loops creaked, but they held. The modular design worked. The 2 pontoons rocked, each in its own way, like 2 joints of a single body. A wave hit one. The other compensated. A wave hit the second. The first absorbed it. They weren't fighting the ocean. They were bending with it. The storm lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of darkness and water and wind. For 6 hours, Do Yoon stood by the mast and counted. Every wave, every blow, every creak. He was looking for a weak spot, a spot that would break first. He found it at the 3 o'clock position, the left hinge. The rope was frayed by a quarter. 3 more hours and it would snap. He shouted to Peck. Peck climbed toward the hinge. In the dark, across the wet planks, a wave nearly washed him away. Lena grabbed the old man by the waist and held him steady. Peck tied off the hinge. A new rope over the old one, roughly, quickly, but securely. The hinge held out for the remaining 3 hours. By dawn, the storm had passed. The sky turned gray. The waves subsided to a meter. The pontoon remained, wet, battered, but intact. All 9 people were alive. So-Din sat by the barrel, wet, shivering, but alive. She said she wanted Do Yoon to know. She had been keeping count. During the 6 hours of the storm, she counted 42 waves that should have capsized them, and not a single one did. She said it wasn't luck, it was the design. Do Yoon nodded. Then he sat down next to her and closed his eyes. He was exhausted. His hands wouldn't obey him. His legs were shaking. 6 hours on his feet in a storm is more than the body can handle. So-Din silently placed her hand on his shoulder. A single touch, brief. Then she withdrew her hand. Do Yoon didn't open his eyes, but he remembered. 2 hours after the storm, Lena found the first gift. The storm had brought debris, lots of debris. Planks, pieces of masts, shreds of sailcloth, barrels, 3 barrels, 1 empty, 1 with salt, real sea salt pressed into a white block. The 3rd with rice, wet, swollen, but rice. When So-Din saw the salt, she clutched the barrel with both hands. She said that salt was currency in this world, that you could buy a boat for this block. Do Yoon said they would build the boat themselves, and the salt was needed for fish. Salted fish keeps for weeks. That solves the problem of supplies. So-Din looked at him, then at the salt, then at him. She was fighting with herself. Her business instincts screamed that the salt should be saved for trade. Engineering logic said the salt should be used for survival. She chose logic. But Do Yoon saw what it cost her. They gathered debris all day. By evening, a mountain of wood lay on the pontoon, plus 4 planks that could be used right away, plus ropes, plus a piece of iron resembling an axe. Tech picked it up and said that it was a fragment of a boarding axe. The blade was dull, but it was metal. It could be sharpened. For the first time, they had a tool that resembled a real one. Do Yoon looked at the pile of materials and did the math. 2 weeks ago, he had 3 planks and 3 desperate women. Now, 2 rafts, 9 people, a tool, salt, rice, wood, rope, a net, and ahead, the open ocean, which tossed them the wreckage of others' misfortunes. He sensed something wrong about it. Their well-being grew out of others' losses. Every plank was someone's sunken ship. Every barrel was someone's lost cargo. But he couldn't afford the luxury of remorse. Not now. Now they had to build. Peck approached him. The old man held out a sharpened fragment of an axe. The blade was still blunt, but already glistened from the stone with which Peck had honed it. Peck said he was ready to build. Do Yoon took the axe. The first real tool in this world. Heavy, rough, but his. Tomorrow they would start on the 3rd pontoon. On the 14th day, a storm hit for 6 hours. The modular structure held up. The hinges worked. Peck restrung the frayed left hinge in the middle of the storm. All 9 survived. After the storm, they gathered the debris. 3 barrels, salt and rice. A fragment of a boarding axe. So-Rin admitted that the structure had saved them. Do Yoon plans to build a 3rd pontoon. By the end of the 3rd week, they had 4 pontoons. Do Yoon and Peck built the 3rd and 4th in 6 days. They had enough materials. The ocean washed up debris almost every day. Sometimes a plank, sometimes a barrel, sometimes a scrap of sail. Once, Lena fished out a whole box of tools. 2 hammers, a saw, 3 chisels, a coil of wire. When Do Yoon saw the saw, he nearly fell to the deck. A saw. A real saw, with teeth. Dull and rusty, but with teeth. Beck took the saw in his hands and stroked the blade as if it were a living thing. Then he began to sharpen it. 2 hours, tooth by tooth. When he was done, the saw cut through wood like butter. The 4 pontoons were connected in pairs by hinges, the 1st to the 2nd, the 3rd to the 4th. The pairs were connected to each other by a bridge. The result was a square platform. 4 modules, 4 points of flexibility. The total area was about 40 square meters. People lived on the 1st pontoon. They slept. They ate. On the 2nd, fish were drying and distillers stood. There were already 8 of them. There was enough water. Not in abundance, but enough. On the 3rd, Pak set up a workshop. A workbench made of a thick plank, tools laid out in order, wood shavings that Jung swept overboard every evening. On the fourth, supplies were stored. Barrels of water, barrels of salted fish. Sorin called it a storeroom and kept track of everything. She had no paper. She scratched numbers onto the boards with a bone knife that Lena had lent her. It was the first time Lena had lent the knife to other than Do Yoon. Do Yoon noticed. Sorin noticed that he had noticed. Both remained silent. People began to change. Min and Hae, who had lain motionless for the first week, were now helping with the fish. Min turned out to be deft with the net. Hae knew how to weave rope from fibers, slowly but surely. Park Soon, an old woman with a sunburnt, turned out to be a herbalist. She knew which seaweeds were edible and which were poisonous. She knew that a certain type of brown seaweed contained iodine and prevented thyroid disease. She didn't put it in those exact words. She said that brown seaweed was good for a sore throat, but Do Yoon understood. On the 20th day, Sorin approached him in the morning. She said they needed to talk. Seriously. Do Yoon sat down. Sorin sat across from him. She said she had done the math. 9 people consume a certain amount of water and food per day. The distillers produce a certain amount of water. Lee, Na, and Min catch a certain amount of fish. Salt supplies are being used up at a certain rate. At the current rate, they can go another 10 days, maybe 12. If they don't find an island within 12 days, shortages will begin. First, water, then food. Do Yoon asked what she suggested. Sorin looked him in the eyes and said they had to decide. Either they head for the wild islands and risk not making it, or they turn toward the inner islands and risk encountering Haegyeong. Do Yoon thought. He looked at Yoon Mei. The priestess was sitting by the mast, staring at the water. He asked for her opinion. Yoon Mei looked up. She said there was a third option. Between the wild islands and the inner islands lies a place sailors call the Rift, a chain of underwater rocks, partially protruding above the water. There is no fresh water there. There are no trees, but there is shallow water. And in the shallow water, there are shellfish and seaweed and birds' nests. And Haegyeong doesn't go there because the rocks tear the hulls of their heavy ships. Do Yoon asked how far it was to the rift. Yoon Mei replied that it was 4 or 5 days. Do Yoon looked at Sorin. Sorin was calculating. 4 or 5 days fit her calculations. She nodded. Lena listened in silence. Then she said she knew the rift, that her clan had hunted there, a long time ago, when the clan was still alive. She fell silent. Do Yoon didn't press her for details. He turned the sail. They headed northwest, toward the rift. On the 22nd day, Yoon Mei woke him in the middle of the night. She touched his shoulder. He opened his eyes. Yoon Mei stood over him, and her face looked strange. Not frightened, not anxious, mesmerized. She told him to get up and look. Do Yoon stood up. He looked over the side and froze. The water was glowing. Not all of it. In bands. Long blue bands stretched across the water's surface from horizon to horizon. They pulsed. Slowly. Rhythmically. Like veins. Yoon Mei whispered that these were the horns of the sea, ancient currents that flow from the eternal storms. The water within them is saturated with creatures that glow. Microscopic ones. Bioluminescence. Do Yoon knew that word from his own world. But here, the scale was different. Not a scattering of sparks in the surf. Entire rivers of light in the dark ocean. Yoon Mei said that the sea roads point the way, that the old navigators followed them as if they were a map, that every road leads to something, to an island, to a storm, to another road. Do Yoon asked where this one led. Yoon Mei pointed northwest, toward the rift. They were heading in the right direction. Do Yoon looked at the glowing water, at the blue pulsating bands, at the ocean that had suddenly ceased to be a hostile void and began to resemble a map, a living map. He remembered Young Mei's words from the early days. The sea is a living organism. Back then, he didn't believe her. Now he stood on the pontoon he had built himself, looking at the glowing veins of the world, and thought that maybe she was right. Young Mei stood beside him, close. Her shoulder brushed against his arm. She said quietly that he was the first person she had shown the roads to. Do Yoon asked why. Yoon Mei replied that it was because he was the first person who didn't laugh when she said the sea was alive. Do Yoon didn't answer. He stood and watched, and the ocean glowed beneath him. And somewhere deep within that light, something was moving. Something big and ancient, something with a yellow eye, something that was waiting. By the end of the third week, 4 pontoons with a total area of 40 square meters had been built. They fished out a box of tools, including a saw and hammers. So Rin kept track of the supplies, scribbling numbers on the boards. So Rin calculated that the supplies would last 10 to 12 days. Yoon-mei suggested going to the Rift, a chain of underwater rocks with shallow water, 4 to 5 days' journey. Hae-gyung doesn't go there. Lee-na knows this place. At night, Yoon-mei showed Do Yoon the sea roads, bioluminescent currents from the eternal storms that function as a map. On the 24th day, they saw the Rift. Lee-na was the first to notice it. She pointed toward the horizon where dark, jagged peaks jutted out of the water. Rocks, black, sharp, scattered across the water like broken teeth. Between them, the water was a different color, lighter, shallower. Do Yoon saw the waves breaking against the rocks and crashing into foam. Beautiful, dangerous. He understood why the heavy ships of Hae-gyung didn't come here. One rock underwater and the hull would be ripped open. But their pontoons had a shallow draft, 30 centimeters, maybe 25. They could go where ships couldn't. Do Yoon steered the pontoon toward the nearest passage between the rocks. Slowly, carefully. Lee-na lay on the bow and looked into the water. She pointed with her hand. Left, right, straight ahead. She could see the bottom. Rocks, shoals, passages. Do Yoon steered the sailboat according to her signals. They sailed for an hour, weaving between the rocks. Several times the bottom scraped against the keel. Do Yoon winced at every sound. The keel was composite. If it broke off on a rock, they would lose control. But the keel held. Then they entered shallow water. The water was waist deep, clear, greenish. On the bottom were rocks covered with shells and seaweed and something else. Lee-na jumped into the water. The water was chest deep. She dove down. She surfaced. In her hands were shells, large ones, the size of a fist. She tossed them onto the pontoon. Then she dove again. 10 minutes later, a pile of shells lay on the planks. Mollusks. Food. Fresh. Alive. Pak soon walked over and began prying open the shells with a bone knife. Inside was meat. White. Firm. They ate them raw. After 2 weeks of dried fish, the taste of the shellfish felt like a feast. So Rin ate 3 and said they were better than the oysters she'd eaten at the banquet at Hae-gyung's house. Then she stopped short. Hae-gyung's name hung in the air. No one brought up the subject again. Do Yoon surveyed the rift. The rocks jutted out of the water a meter or two. Some were flat on top. You could stand on them. On one, he noticed bird nests. Dozens of them. White clumps of feathers and seaweed. The birds were squawking and circling overhead. Eggs. Egg whites. Protein. He looked at Beck. Peck looked at the rocks. Then at Do Yoon. He said he understood. If they tied the pontoon to a rock, the rock would act as an anchor. The pontoon would stop drifting. For the first time in 24 days, they would come to a stop. Do Yoon nodded. They tied the pontoon to 2 rocks, with ropes through iron brackets that Peck had hammered into the stone. The pontoon froze. It stopped rocking. Not entirely. The waves were still coming, but it was a completely different kind of rocking. Gentle, lazy, not threatening. So Rin stepped off the pontoon onto the rock. She stood on the stone, solid, unmoving. Not planks beneath her feet, but stone. She stood there in silence. Then her shoulders began to shake. Do Yoon thought she was crying, but when So-rin turned around, her face was dry. She wasn't crying. She was trembling because for the first time in 24 days, there was no water beneath her. Yoon-mei also stepped onto the rock. She sank to her knees. She placed her palms on the rock. She closed her eyes. Her lips moved. A prayer, or gratitude, or both. Lee-na didn't leave the pontoon. She stood and looked at the water, at the shallows, at the shadows moving beneath the surface. Fish. Lots of fish. She said the hunting was good here. Before, Yoon had begun to plan. The fault line provided what they lacked in the open ocean. An anchor, stability, the resources of the shallows, shellfish, seaweed, bird eggs, fish in the shallows that are easier to catch, and stone on the cliffs, which can be used as ballast, as an anchor, as a foundation. He looked at Peck. Peck was already tapping the rock with a hammer, testing the rock. He said the stone was dense, volcanic, doesn't crumble, good stone. Do Yoon said they would stay here. Not forever, but for a long time. So-rin asked why. Do Yoon answered. First, to restock supplies. Second, to rest. The people are exhausted. Over 3 weeks on the open ocean, they need a day. 2, 3, without fear that a storm will capsize them at night. Third, to build. Do Yoon pointed at the rocks. 2 rocks side by side, 7 meters of water between them, shallow, waist deep. If we lay planks across those rocks, we'll have a bridge. If we stretch ropes between the bridge and the pontoon, we'll have a dock. If we tie other pontoons to the dock, we'll have a base. So Rin listened. Her eyes changed. Do Yoon saw her switch from survival mode to planning mode. Different modes, a different sparkle. She said that if there's a base here, we can attract traders, small-time ones, the kind who fear Haegyong on the major routes. They need a place where they can repair their ships, stock up on water, rest. If we offer that, the traders will bring what we're missing: cloth, metal, grain. Do Yoon looked at her. She was thinking like a merchant. He was thinking like an engineer. Together, it worked. He said that for this, they needed a shipyard, a place where ships could be repaired. So-rin nodded. She said that for this, they needed a reputation. A rumor that somewhere in the rift, there were people who repaired ships and didn't rob them. Do Yoon replied that reputation starts with the first customer, and the ocean brings the first customer. Just as it had brought them the rowboat with Peck, just as it had brought the wreckage after the storm. So-rin was silent. Then she said she hated him, because he was always right, and it was unbearable. Do Yoon replied that he wasn't always right, that the 4 nails on the starboard side of the first pontoon still troubled him. So-rin looked at him, for a long time, with an expression Do Yoon couldn't read. Then she turned away and went to count the shellfish supplies. In the evening, they sat on the rock, all 9 of them, for the first time, not on planks but on stone. They ate shellfish and boiled rice. Peck lit a fire, the first fire in 24 days. He used flint from the rock and shavings from the workshop. A spark fell on the dry shavings. Smoke rose, then a flame, small, faint, but a flame. So-rin watched the fire, silently. Yoon-mei was crying, quietly, soundlessly. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Lee-na sat a little ways off. She wasn't looking at the fire. She was looking at the people gathered around it, at their faces lit by the flames, at Min, who was smiling for the first time ever, at Hae, who was warming her hands, at Park Sun, who was roasting a clam on a flat stone, at Jong, who was leaning against Beck and had closed her eyes, at So-rin, who was counting something under her breath but whose eyes were shining, at Yoon-mei, who was crying, at Do Yoon, who was sitting and looking at the fire and saw not flames but a blueprint, a future pier, a future shipyard, a future street. Lee-na approached Do Yoon, quietly. He didn't notice her until she sat down beside him, close, closer than ever. She didn't say anything. She just sat there. Do Yoon didn't move. They sat and watched the fire. The first fire in this world. The first stop. The first stone under their feet. Tomorrow he would start building the pier. The day after tomorrow, the shipyard. In a week, there would be something resembling a home here. Not a ship, not a raft. A home. And people would come. He knew it. The ocean was full of lost people. They would find this place. They would sail toward the fire visible at night, and he would build a place for each of them, just for them, because that was the only thing he truly knew how to do, build a place for people who had nowhere else to go. On the 24th day they reached the rift, a chain of volcanic rocks with shallow waters. They tied the pontoons to the rocks. Their first stop in all this time, shellfish and bird eggs. Peck lit the first fire, so Rin proposed a strategy, to create a repair station for small traders who fear the Haegyong routes. The traders would bring cloth, metal, and grain. Do Yoon planned to build a pier and a shipyard on the rocks. Lee-na sat close to him for the first time. The first merchant arrived on the 30th day, a small sloop with a torn sail and a scorched hull. Do Yoon spotted it in the morning while checking the dock. In 6 days at the fault, they had built a lot. A dock made of planks between 2 cliffs. A shipyard platform on a flat rock with a canvas canopy. A distillation setup consisting of 6 stills connected into a single system. A fish smokehouse on a separate rock. Pak had built a hoist out of rope and a pulley to pull boats onto the shallows for repairs. Rough, creaky, but it worked. The rowboat approached cautiously. There was only one person on board. A man, young, thin, with a bandaged arm. He saw the pontoons tied to the rocks and the smoke from the smokehouse, and the people on the pier. And he stopped. So Rin stepped forward. She stood on the pier in her thin shirt, her back straight, speaking in a voice that would have made the merchants of her former home stand at attention. She asked who he was and what he wanted. The man introduced himself as Kang, a fisherman from the village of Kumhe. The village had been burned down by pirates flying the turtle flag. He had been sailing for a week. His arm is broken. The boat is leaking. He asks for water and, if possible, for the side to be repaired. So-rin looked at Do Yoon. Do Yoon looked at the boat, the charred side. 3 planks were burned right through. The holes were plugged with rags. It could be fixed. 2 hours of work for Beck, maybe 3. He nodded to So-rin. So-rin turned to Kang and said they would repair his side and give him water. She asked what he had to trade. Kang said nothing. Everything had burned up. So-rin was silent for a moment. Then she said that in that case, he would pay with his labor. One day, any work they assigned him. Kang agreed. Beck repaired the side in 2 hours. Zhang and Da-hee helped. Kang worked all day with one hand. He hauled rocks. He wove rope. He cleaned fish. In the evening, they gave him water and food and a place on the pontoon to spend the night. In the morning, Kang sailed away. But before that, he asked what this place was called. So-rin opened her mouth to answer, but Do Yoon spoke first. The Rift. Just the Rift. Kang nodded and sailed away. 4 days later, 2 sloops arrived, then another one, then a boat with a family of 6. Kang told them. At every port he called at, he said there were people in the Rift who repair ships, give water, don't rob, don't kill. The word spread, slowly, like a current, but it spread. By the end of the 5th week, 23 people were living at the Rift. 4 pontoons became 6. The pier doubled in size. Peck built a second hoist for larger boats. Do Yoon designed every new platform. He drew blueprints on boards. Peck carved the blueprints into wood. So-rin kept track of everything. Supplies, consumption, trade, work hours. She set up an accounting system on 12 boards that she kept in a separate box. She called it the bookkeeping. Lee Na hunted. Not alone anymore. Min went with her. And Kang, who returned a week later and said he wanted to stay. His hand had healed. Not completely, but enough to hold a harpoon. Yoon Mei did what she did best. She listened to the people who came to the Rift, refugees, the wounded, frightened, those who had lost everything. She sat with them, silently, held their hands, prayed if they asked, spoke if needed, until Yoon saw how people would straighten their shoulders after talking to her, as if someone had lifted an invisible burden from them. He didn't understand how she did it, but he understood that it was important, that a city isn't just boards and nails. A city is a place where someone will listen to you. On the 38th day, So-rin came to him in the evening. She said she needed to tell him something. Not about supplies, not about trade, about herself. Do Yoon sat down. So-rin sat across from him. She said that when the house of Haegyong burned down her warehouses, she didn't lose her goods. She lost herself. 3 ships, a crew of 120, a reputation she'd built over 10 years, all in a single night. She said that on the raft in those early days she wanted to die, not from thirst, from emptiness, from the fact that she was nobody anymore, that her word was worthless, that her skills were useless. And then he started building and asked her to count. And suddenly it turned out that her mind was needed, that the numbers in her head were needed, that someone was building while telling her to count because it wouldn't work without her. So Rin fell silent. Then she said that this was the first time someone had given her not money, not a position, not status, but a place where she was needed not because she was rich, but because she was smart. Do Yoon was silent. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't consciously created a place for her. He just knew he needed someone who could calculate, and she calculated better than anyone. So Rin stood up. She walked over to him. She leaned in. She kissed him, quickly, briefly, on the lips. Then she straightened up, said it hadn't happened, turned around and left. Do Yoon sat and watched her go. Then he touched his lips. Then he looked at the drawing of the new pontoon. Then he touched his lips again. Then he picked up a piece of charcoal and continued drawing. A minute later, he realized he wasn't drawing a pontoon, but something else. A separate platform. A small one. With a roof. With shelves along the walls. With a table in the center. An accounting office. For her. The first merchant, Kang, arrived on the 30th day, so Rin organized an exchange of services. Word got around, and by the end of the 5th week, 23 people were living at the fault, 6 pontoons, a pier, and a shipyard. So Rin handles the bookkeeping. Yoon Mei listens to the refugees and helps them. So Rin told Do Yoon that he had given her a place. She kissed him. Do Yoon began designing an accounting office for So Rin. By the end of the 2nd month, 40 people were living at the fault, 8 pontoons, 2 piers, a shipyard, a smokehouse, a freshwater station with 12 distillers, and a flag. So Yoon came up with the flag. Do Yoon didn't know when she had arrived. One morning, he simply saw a girl sitting on the edge of the pier, drawing something on a piece of canvas with a piece of charcoal. She was 19, a navigator's daughter. Her father had died when Haegyong sank their ship. So-yeon had survived on a piece of wreckage, 3 days in the water. She was picked up by a merchant heading to the rift for repairs. She was drawing a map, from memory. Do Yoon approached and looked. The map was rough, but accurate. The coastline matched what Yoon Mei had described. The islands were in their proper places. Currents were marked with arrows. Do Yoon asked how she knew all this. So-yeon replied that she remembered, that her father had shown her maps since she was a child, that she remembered every one she had ever seen. Do Yoon sat down beside her. He looked at the map and thought. Then he took a needle out of his pocket, a real steel needle they'd found in the wreckage a week ago. He picked up a shell, flat, concave. He poured water into it. He placed the needle on the surface of the water. The needle floated for a second, then it stopped, and turned, one end pointing north. A compass. Primitive, unreliable, but a compass. So-yeon watched this with her mouth agape. She asked how he did it. Do-yeon replied that the needle was magnetized, that if you rub a steel needle against silk, it becomes a magnet. So-yeon asked what a magnet was. Do-yeon explained. So-yeon listened as if he were reading sacred scripture. Then she asked him to show her more. Do-yeon showed her the sextant, the one he had assembled from a seashell, a needle, and thread in the early days. He explained the principle, the angle between the horizon and a star. If you know the angle and the time, you know the latitude. So-yeon grasped this knowledge like a drowning person clutching a rope. In 3 days, she mastered the sextant. Within a week, she began plotting a course more accurately than Yoon Mei did by intuition. Do Yoon called her Captain Choi, as a joke, in front of everyone. After she corrected the course of a merchant sloop heading for the rift that had been off by 10 degrees. So-yeon blushed so hard that even her ears turned crimson. But she remembered, and from then on, she signed her charts exactly that way. Captain Choi. The flag she drew was simple, a blue circle on a white background, a compass pointing to the center, that is, to home. Do Yoon looked at the drawing, then at So-yeon, then at the drawing. He said it was good. So-yeon drew the flag on a sail. Baek carved the flagpole. Yoon Mei gave her blessing. So-yeon calculated the costs and recorded them in the ledger. 1 sail, 1 piece of charcoal. They hoisted the flag on the mast of the main pontoon. It was crooked, and the paint had run from the moisture, but it was there, and when the wind filled it, Do Yoon saw how 40 people on 8 pontoons raised their heads and looked up, and something changed, not in the structure, in the people. Before that, they had been refugees, lost, adrift. Now they had a flag, and the flag meant they weren't just surviving, they existed. A week after the flag went up, Cho Ha-eun arrived. She paddled up in a canoe, alone, with a bandaged shoulder and a bag of tools. When she saw Baek's shipyard, she stopped. She stood on the pier and watched. For a long time, Do Yoon approached. She asked who had built it. Do Yoon replied that he had designed it and Baek had built it. Ha-eun looked at the blueprint for the new pontoon lying on the workbench. She stood over it for 10 minutes, tracing the lines with her finger. Then she said quietly, "It could have been done this way." Do Yoon asked what she meant. Ha-eun replied that she was a carpenter, a master carpenter. She had worked at the Haegyong shipyard for 5 years. She built ships based on their blueprints. The blueprints were bad. She knew they were bad. She spoke up. No one listened to her. Because there's no such thing as a female carpenter. That's what they told her. She found proof that Haegyong was forging safety certificates for passenger ships. She tried to report it. They tried to kill her. a knife in the shoulder. She escaped in a canoe. Do Yoon listened. Then he showed her the shipyard, the tools, the supply of wood, blueprints. Ha Eun looked at it all with the eyes of someone who had found what she'd been searching for her whole life. Beck approached. He looked at her hands, large, calloused. He handed her a hammer. Ha Eun took it. She walked over to the unfinished pontoon. She struck a nail, once, clean, precise. The nail went all the way in. Beck nodded, and said that now there were 3 of them. By evening, Ha Eun and Do Yoon were poring over the frame drawing, arguing about the thickness. Ha Eun said 3 fingers width was enough. Do Yoon said 4. Ha Eun replied that an extra finger meant extra weight. Do Yoon replied that an extra finger meant a margin of safety. Ha Eun fell silent. She looked at him, and said that he was the first person to argue with her about the thickness of the bulkhead and actually be right. Sorin watched this from the neighboring pontoon. Do Yoon could feel her gaze. He didn't turn around, but he knew she was watching, and he knew she didn't like it, and he knew it would be a problem. But right now, he had a bulkhead that needed to be finished. By the end of the 2nd month, there were 40 people on 8 pontoons. So Yeon showed up and became the navigator. Do Yoon showed her the compass and sextant and introduced her to Captain Choi. Se-young drew a flag, a blue circle on a white background, a compass pointing home. Cho Ha-yoon arrived, a former senior carpenter at the Haegyong shipyard. She had fled after discovering that the strength certificates had been forged. Ha-yoon became the 3rd builder. So-rin watched Do Yoon and Ha-yoon grow closer with displeasure. In the 3rd month, Da-hee arrived, and war broke out. Da-hee sailed in on a rowboat with 2 wounded fishermen, a former naval doctor in the Tonhae Principality's navy. She left after being forbidden to treat prisoners. She climbed onto the pier. She looked around. She saw people with scrapes and burns that no one was treating. She saw Park Sun treating cuts with seaweed poultices. Da-hee approached Park Sun and calmly said that a poultice was useless for this wound, that it needed to be washed with boiled water and stitched up. Park Sun looked at her. Da-hee took a needle and thread out of her bag. Real surgical thread, thin, strong. She stitched up the wound in 3 minutes. Park Sun watched. Then she nodded and walked away. That evening, Da-hee found Do Yoon. He was sitting at the shipyard drawing. She sat down next to him. She said she needed a place to treat people, a clean one, with good lighting, with running water if possible. Do Yoon looked at her. She was 30, older than him, a calm face, ironic eyes, hands that didn't tremble even when she was stitching up a laceration on a swaying pontoon. He said he would build her a hospital. Da-hee raised an eyebrow. She said a canopy and a table would suffice. Do Yoon replied that a canopy and a table weren't a hospital, that people who come to see a doctor need to feel safe, and safety starts with a roof that doesn't leak and walls that don't sway. Da-hee looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was a strange doctor for an engineer. Do Yoon replied that he wasn't a doctor. He builds places for people, and she treats people in those places. Everyone does their part. Da-hee smiled, for the first time. The next day, Do Yoon came to her with a cut on his palm. He'd cut himself on the edge of a plank at the shipyard. He sat down at her makeshift table. He held out his hand and said he wouldn't trust his body to anyone but her. He asked her to please be careful. Da-hee stitched him up in silence. When she finished, he left. Da-hee stood at the edge of the pontoon with her back to him. Her shoulders were trembling. 3 days later, the hospital platform was ready. A separate pontoon, a canvas roof, 3 walls made of planks, the 4th open to the light, an examination table, shelves for instruments, and a window that Do Yoon had cut out specifically to face east. Morning light, the most even, best for treating wounds. When Da-hee saw the window, she stood in front of it for a minute. Then she turned to Do Yoon and asked how he knew she needed light from the east. Do Yoon replied that he had read about it. Da-hee didn't ask what he had read. War came that very day. By evening, Lee Na was the first to spot the sails. 3 ships, not merchant vessels, military ships, with black hulls and red pennants. So Rin turned pale. She said it was the Haegyong House Patrol Squadron. 3 steel wave-class corvettes, fast, armed. Do Yoon asked how many men were on each. So Rin replied that there were 30 to 40 fighters plus the crew. Do Yoon did the math. 120 armed men against 40 civilians, including the elderly and children. He looked at the rift, at the cliffs, at the shallows between them, at the passages, narrow, winding, through which he had guided his pontoons with a draft of 25 centimeters. The Haegyong corvettes sat in water 1.5 meters deep. they wouldn't make it through. They knew that. That's why they'd anchored in the outer roadstead, half a mile from the cliffs, and raised a signal. So Rin read it. She said the signal meant a demand to surrender, to hand over all refugees from Haegyong's territories, to surrender the shipyard, to surrender the supplies, or be sunk. Do Yoon was silent. Then he asked if they had catapults or long-range weapons. So Rin said that corvettes of this class were equipped with ballistas, range 300 meters. They were at 400, right on the edge. Do Yoon asked if they could get closer. Lee Na answered for everyone. She said there was a deep passage to the northwest, narrow, but the corvettes could pass through one after another, if they knew about it. Do Yoon asked if they knew. Lee Na said that Haegyong's navigators knew these waters. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Do Yoon couldn't take the risk. He gathered everyone, 40 people, standing on the pontoons and rocks. He said they had one night. By morning, Haegyong would either find the passage or leave. If they found it, they would enter. And if they entered, 40 men with fishing knives against 120 soldiers. That wouldn't be a battle. It would be a massacre. They had to block the passage. Ha Yoon was the first to understand. She asked how. Do Yoon replied, underwater spikes, sharp oars and stakes driven into the seabed at the entrance to the passage, pointing upward, half a meter deep, invisible from the surface. The corvette enters the passage. The hull hits the stakes. A hole. The corvette sinks in the narrow passage and blocks it for the rest. Ha-eun looked at him. Then she said that was cruel. Do Yoon replied that 120 soldiers against old men and children was cruel too. Ha-eun was silent. Then she went to sharpen the stakes. They worked all night, all 40 of them. Beck sharpened the oars with an axe. Ha-eun drove them into the bottom in the shallow water of the passage. Lee Na dived down and checked the depth. Do Yoon stood waist-deep in the water and measured the distance between the stakes. Every half meter, 3 rows, 28 stakes. So Rin counted the supply of oars and organized the work. Yoon Mei stood on the rock and watched the corvettes. Their lights were burning in the outer roadstead, 3 yellow dots in the darkness. By dawn, the passage was closed. 28 sharpened stakes underwater, invisible, deadly. Do Yoon stood on the rock and watched the corvettes. They weren't moving. In the morning, a rowboat broke away from them. It headed toward the rocks. There was one man in the rowboat, an officer in a black uniform. He came within 30 meters and shouted that he was giving them an hour. After an hour, they'll come in. Do Yoon shouted back that the entrance was clear. Let them come in. The officer looked at him, at the flag with the blue circle, at the people on the pontoons. Then he turned and sailed back. An hour later, the first corvette moved toward the passage, slowly, carefully. Do Yoon stood on the rock and watched. His heart was in his throat. His hands were wet, not from the water. The corvette entered the passage. The bow passed the first row of stakes. Do Yoon heard the screech of wood against wood, then a crash, deafening, heavy. The corvette jerked. It stopped. It listed. Shouts came from the deck. Water gushed into the breach. The corvette sat on the stakes like a spit. Water rose up the sides. 10 minutes later, the corvette lay on its side. The passage was blocked. The 2 remaining corvettes stood in the outer roadstead. They did not move. An hour, 2, 3. Then they hoisted their sails and left. So Rin stood next to Do Yoon. She said they would return with a large fleet. Do Yoon replied that he knew, but for now, they were gone, and he had time. Time to build, time to prepare, time to make the rift impregnable. Da-hee arrived and became a doctor. Do Young built her a hospital platform with a window facing east. 3 Haegyong corvettes arrived at the rift. They demanded surrender. In a single night, Do Young installed 28 underwater stakes in the only deep passage. The first corvette ran aground the stakes and blocked the passage. The other 2 left. So Rin said they would return. They returned 3 months later. Do Yoon worked on it every day. By the 6-month mark, the rift had changed beyond recognition. 12 pontoons connected by a modular network, 2 piers, the shipyard where Ha-eun and Beck built the first real catamaran, fast, light, with a double hull and a sail that So-yeon calculated based on wind angles. Da-hee's hospital, So-rin's accounting office on a separate pontoon with a desk and shelves. Yoon-mei's temple on a separate platform, small, with curtains that Yoon-mei chose herself. She stood in front of 2 pieces of fabric for an hour and couldn't decide which one to hang. Then she chose the blue one. And she cried, and she laughed. Lena's hunting platform with a ladder into the water and harpoon racks. A school for children, 8 refugee children. Lena taught them to hunt from the water. It was Do Yoon's idea. When he told her, she was silent for a long time. Then she went and started. On the first day, the children laughed. Lee Na froze. Do Yoon saw her face. She didn't know what to do with the children's laughter. She was used to people falling silent at the sight of her, to being feared, that she brought silence. But here the children were laughing, not at her, with her, because she showed them how to throw a harpoon and missed on purpose, and they guffawed. In the evening, Lee Na sat on the edge of the pontoon. Turning away, her shoulders were shaking. Do Young sat down beside her, silently. He didn't ask. He didn't comfort her. He just sat there. 5 minutes later, Lee Na rested her head on his shoulder. Their first touch. They sat like that until it got dark. More than 100 people lived on the fault. They had streets, not real ones, bridges between the pontoons. But So Rin had given them names. Main Street, Shipyard Street, Fish Street, Temple Street. Do Yoon said it was too early for streets. So Rin replied that it was never too early for streets, that names make a place a home. Do Yoon didn't argue. When the Haegyong ships appeared on the horizon, So Yun saw them first. She counted the sails. 28. When So Rin heard the number, she turned pale. 28 ships, a full-fledged combat fleet, the flagship of the Iron Wind class. This was no patrol. This was a punitive expedition. Haegyong Jinsok, the youngest son of the house, commander of the Straits punitive fleet. He had come in person. Do Yoon stood on the upper deck of the main pontoon and looked at the 28 sails. Standing nearby were Baek, Ha-eun, So-rin, Lee Na, Yoon-mei, Da-hee, and So-yun. Everyone. So-rin said this was the end. Do Yoon replied that it wasn't. He said he had a plan, one he'd devised 3 months ago. On the night the first corvettes left, he knew they'd return, and he knew they'd return with an army. And for all 3 months, he hadn't just been building a city. He'd been building a machine, modular, detachable, capable of moving. 12 pontoons, each autonomous, each with its own sail, each connected to its neighbors by detachable hinges. 6 catamarans, fast, armed with harpoon turrets that Baek and Ha-eun had been building for the past month. And the rift, the cliffs, the shallows, the passages he had studied for 3 months. Every rock, every shoal, every current. So-yun had mapped it all out, the most accurate map of the rift in history. Do Yoon gathered all the captains, 8 men. Each was in charge of his own module or catamaran. He explained the plan, simply, clearly, like a technical manual. When the Haegyong fleet enters the rift, the city will be exposed. The modules would fan out in pre-calculated courses. The catamarans would emerge from their hiding places behind the rocks. The Haegyong fleet would find itself in a labyrinth of rocks and pontoons. Their heavy ships would snag on the seabed. Their formation would collapse. And then the rift will become a trap. So Rin listened. Then she said the plan was insane. Do Yoon replied that it was an engineering plan. Ha-eun said the structure would hold. Baek said the hinges were ready. So-yun said the courses were calculated. Lee Na said nothing. She took a harpoon and went to her catamaran. Yoon-mei approached Do Yoon. She said she needed to tell him something, right now. Do Yoon looked at her. Yoon-mei said that the Morning Mother was moving. The eternal storm, which had hovered over the same coordinates for 200 years, had shifted to the southeast, toward the rift, toward him. Do Yoon asked how she knew. Yoon-mei pointed at the water. It was warm, warmer than usual. The sea roads glowed brighter. Everything was moving in one direction, toward them. Yoon-mei said the storm was coming, not in a month, not in a week, tomorrow, at the same time as the fleet. Do Young looked at her, then at the fleet on the horizon, then at the sky, clear, cloudless, not a trace of a storm. Yoon-mei said he had to believe her, just this once. Do Young was silent for a moment, then he nodded. In 3 months, the rift had grown to 100 people and 2 pontoons with streets. Lee Na began teaching the children to hunt and cried for the first time at their laughter. Yoon-mei chose the curtains for the temple. 28 Haegyong ships led by Jin Sok arrived at the rift. Do Yoon had spent 3 months preparing a plan, a modular city capable of unfolding in battle. 6 catamarans with harpoon towers. Yoon-mei said that the Morning Mother had set out and would arrive tomorrow with the fleet. The morning of the final day was quiet. No wind, no waves. The ocean lay as smooth as a sheet of glass. Do Yoon stood on the upper deck of the main pontoon and gazed at the horizon. 28 sails were heading toward the rift in perfect formation. Beautiful. Deadly. So Yun stood nearby with a map. She said the fleet would be at the entrance in 2 hours. Do Yoon nodded. He looked up at the sky. Clear. Blue. No storm. He looked at the water. Warm. Unnaturally warm. The sea roads he had seen at night converged on the rift from all sides, like veins leading to the heart. He trusted Yoon Mei, but there was no storm. Do Yoon went down to the main deck. Everyone was waiting there. So Rin with the register, Li Na with the chick, Yoon Mei with the medallion, Ha Un with a hammer, Da Hee with a tool bag, So Yun with a map, Beck with an axe. 100 people on 12 pontoons and 6 catamarans. 100 people who, 6 months ago, were nobodies, refugees, drowning, lost. And now they stood and waited for battle, for their home. Do Yoon walked around the city. He checked every hinge, every cable, every connector. Ha Un walked beside him. She was checking the same things. Their hands worked in parallel, without words. She checked the left side. He checked the right. When they met in the center, Ha Un said everything was holding up. Do Yoon said that the 4 nails on the starboard side of the first pontoon still worried him. Ha Un looked at him. Then she said she'd hammered 6 extra ones in there 2 months ago. She hadn't told him. She'd just done it. Do Yoon looked at her. She shrugged and walked over to her catamaran. Do Yoon returned to the upper deck. The fleet was closer. He could see the flagship, huge, dark, with red pennants on every mast. A man in black stood at the bow, Haegyong Jin-sok. Even from this distance, Do Yoon could see that he was young and that he wasn't afraid. The first ships entered the rift, slowly, carefully. They knew about the underwater stakes. Ahead, rowboats with sounding lines measured the depth. Do Yoon waited. 5 ships entered. 10. They stretched out in a chain through the narrow passages between the rocks, exactly what he had counted on. On the open sea, 28 ships are a wall. In a labyrinth of rocks, 28 ships are 28 separate targets. Do Yoon raised his hand. On every pontoon and catamaran, people were looking at him, waiting. He lowered his hand and said one word, open. The city came alive. 12 pontoons unhooked their hinges. They parted, each in its own direction. On the courses So-yeon had calculated a week ago, 6 catamarans emerged from behind the rocks, fast, light, with harpoon towers at the bow. They glided between the rocks like fish. Where Haegyong's heavy ships could barely turn, the catamarans passed without slowing down. Haegyong's fleet was trapped, rocks on one side, pontoons on the other, catamarans between them. The ships couldn't form a line. They couldn't support each other. Each fought for itself. Li Na, on the lead catamaran, was heading straight for the nearest corvette. She stood at the bow with a harpoon. Do Yoon told her over the horn to strike the second mast, not the first. The first mast is the sail. The second is the mainsail. Without the mainsail, the corvette would lose its maneuverability. Li Na threw the harpoon. She hit it. The rope from the tower pulled the mast. The mast snapped. The corvette spun in place. So-young shouted the course over the loudspeaker. 20 degrees north in 1 minute. Turn to 110 in 30 seconds. The catamarans obeyed. The pontoons maneuvered. The city broke apart into pieces, and every piece bit back. Haegyong Jin-sok on the flagship finally realized what was happening. He ordered a retreat. But there was nowhere to retreat to. The passages were blocked by his own ships. 3 corvettes ran aground. 2 collided while trying to turn. Chaos. Do Yoon stood on the upper deck of the central platform. He lowered the ballast. The platform settled into the water up to its side. Low, heavy, stable, a floating fortress. 4 harpoon towers at the corners. All around were rocks and debris, and his city, moving like a living body. He spoke into the megaphone, calmly, steadily, as if at a planning meeting. Ha Un, detach the eastern module. We'll go around them. Li Na, left corvette, harpoon, helm. Beck, block the passage with the 4th pontoon. So-yeon, set course 10 degrees west in 2 minutes. The city obeyed him as a body obeys the brain, because every person stood in the place that had been built for them. So Rin, in the accounting chamber, tallied losses and resources and relayed them to each module. Da Hee, on the hospital pontoon, received the wounded. Yoon Mei stood on the platform. She wasn't praying, she was looking at the sky, and the sky was changing. Over the course of an hour of battle, the horizon had darkened. A wall came from the west. Not clouds, a wall. Black. From the water to the sky, The wind dropped to zero. Then it struck with such force that two of Haegyong's ships capsized instantly. The Morning Mother, the eternal storm, 200 years in one place, and now it had shifted and come here. Do Yoon looked at the wall and understood, not with his head, with something deeper. The storm hadn't come to destroy them. The storm had come for him. Yoon Mei turned toward him across the entire rift. Their eyes met. She nodded. Do Young raised his hand. The city froze. The catamarans stopped. The pontoons ceased maneuvering, and the Morning Mother struck. Not the city, the fleet. A narrow column, pinpoint. A black vortex descended upon Jin Sok's flagship. The ship rose 3 meters into the air and crashed down. The masts snapped. The hull cracked. Jin Sok clung to the railing and shouted orders that no one could hear over the roar of the wind. The water boiled around the flagship. The storm lashed only at the Haegyong ships. Only at them. The pontoons rocked, hard. But they didn't break. The rocks protected them. The modular design absorbed the blows, and the storm. The storm knew which were its own. 20 minutes later, it was all over. The Morning Mother rose back up. She ascended. She dissolved into the sky. She left behind silence and wreckage. Of the 28 Haegyong ships, 11 remained afloat. The rest were aground or sinking. The flagship lay on its side near the cliff. Jin Sok was alive. He stood waist-deep in water on the wreckage of his ship and looked at Do Yoon. Across 300 meters of water and debris, silently. Do Yoon looked at him, young, talented, broken. Not by weapons, not by tactics, by something he couldn't understand. Jin Sok turned around, clambered onto the surviving corvette, and led the remnants of the fleet away. Silently, without signals, without flags, he just left. Do Yoon stood on the upper deck and watched them go. His hands were shaking. His legs wouldn't hold him. He sat right down on the planks. So-rin climbed up to him. She handed him a towel. He wiped his face. Lee-na climbed up after her. She handed him hot tea. He didn't ask where the hot tea had come from in the middle of the battle. Yoon Mei brought a dry shirt. Da-hee examined a scrape on his cheekbone that he hadn't noticed. Ha-eun was the last to climb up. She placed a blueprint in front of him. A new platform, the second tier. She'd been drawing it for a week. She'd been waiting for this moment. So-yeon unfolded a map, the one where the rift was marked not with a dot, but with a circle, with a name. Haedo, the sea route. Do Yoon looked at them, the 6 of them, at the city sleeping after the battle, at the dispersing clouds overhead. He remembered the ferry, the night voyage from Vietnam, the cracked seam, the report they swept under the rug. 120 people who went down because no one heard him. And this world, this ocean, these people, who listened. From the very first day, from the very first knot, from the very first plank. The sea was searching for the man they hadn't heard, to give him a second chance, to finish what the previous one hadn't finished. Yoon Mei had spoken of this. The master of the sea. 200 years ago, someone tried to build a city on the water, and failed. And his pain became the Morning Mother. The storm didn't come to kill him. The storm came to pass the torch. And Do Yoon cried for the first time in all that time, not out of fear, not out of exhaustion, because he was finally heard. So-rin sat down next to him, silently. Lee-na sat on the other side, silently. Yoon Mei placed her hand on his shoulder. Da-hee took his hand and held it. Ha-eun sat across from him and watched. So-yoon sat at his feet, pressing the map to her chest. Beck stood on the stairs and looked at them all, at the 6 women surrounding one man, at the city that stood because this man had built it, at the flag with the blue circle fluttering in the wind. The old man said quietly to himself, "Now this is a city." Do Yoon wiped his eyes. He looked at Ha-eun's blueprint, the second tier, a new platform. He looked at So-yoon's map, Haedo, the maritime route. A country, not a dot. He stood up. His legs were still shaking, but he stood up. He looked at the six of them, at the city, at the ocean, and said quietly, "Tomorrow we start the second tier." So Rin smiled, Li Na nodded, Yoon Mei closed her eyes, Da Hee shook her head and said that first he should sit down and let her treat that scrape. Do Yoon sat down. Da Hee treated the scrape, carefully, just as he'd asked. Ha Eun unfolded the blueprint on the boards and began explaining the design of the second tier. So Yeon was already calculating the adjustment for the new current. So Rin opened her notebook and began taking notes. Li Na went to the bow and stood with her harpoon, on guard, as always. Yoon Mei went to her shrine. She lit a candle and whispered two names, the name of the sea and the name of Do Yoon. The ocean lay still, warm, calm. Something was moving beneath its surface, something enormous, with a yellow eye. It circled around Hado, slowly, calmly, not like a predator, like a guardian. The sun was setting below the horizon. The first day of the new world was coming to an end, and tomorrow they would have to build.